The first thing he felt was hunger. Not the kind you feel when you've skipped lunch and your stomach is growling. The real kind. The crushing kind. The kind that makes your vision go dark and your hands shake. The second thing he sensed was a smell. Dampness. Smoke. Sour sweat soaked into the straw he was lying on. The third thing he heard was the faint cry of a child coming from behind the wooden partition. Aiden Rowe opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of blackened planks. Only he wasn't Aiden Rowe. He was Daniel Carter, 34 years old, an agronomist, a Cornell graduate. And the last thing he remembered was the rented pickup truck veering off the road into a ravine somewhere in Kenya. He should have been dead. Instead, he was lying in a mud hut, and his body was someone else's. Young, skin and bones, 18 years old. A translucent window flashed in his mind, letters in a foreign language that for some reason he understood. Accelerated plant growth, plus 999%. And that was it. No weapons, no magic, no fireballs, just plants growing faster. Daniel closed his eyes and lay motionless for a few seconds. Then he sat up. His head spun with weakness. A girl was crying behind the partition. He stood up and stepped behind the planks. A woman in her 40s was sitting on the dirt floor. She was so thin that her cheekbones jutted out like stones beneath her skin. She was grinding some kind of stems in a clay bowl. Next to her, on a rag, lay a girl of about 7. Her belly was swollen, not from food, but from hunger. Daniel recognized this symptom. He'd seen it in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Sudan. Kwashiorkor, protein energy malnutrition. The woman looked up at him. She said he'd finally woken up and that he'd been unconscious for 3 days. She called him son. So this must be Aiden's mother, Hannah Rowe. Daniel looked at the little girl, his sister, Lily, 7 years old. He crouched down beside her and touched her forehead. Hot. Not critical, but borderline. Hannah said their father had died last winter of consumption, that the tax collector had come yesterday, that they owed Baron Crane a debt, 2 sacks of grain by fall. If they didn't pay, he'd take the house. He'd take the plot of land. All that would be left was the road and the ditch. Daniel listened and did the math at the same time. 2 sacks of grain, about 120 kilograms of wheat, on a quarter-acre plot with depleted soil in 4 months, without fertilizer, without decent seeds, without tools. In his old world, that would have been impossible. Here, he had a multiplier, plus 999%, a 10-fold acceleration in growth. He stood up and walked toward the door. Hannah called out to him and asked where he was going. Daniel said he needed to look at the land. She watched him go, and he saw fear in her eyes, not because he was leaving, but because he had become someone else. 3 days unconscious, and he'd woken up a stranger. He stepped out onto the porch. Before him lay a plot of land, a quarter-acre of gray, leached earth, 3 rows of stunted turnips, a fence made of crooked stakes. To the right, the neighbor's house, the same kind of shack. To the left was a ravine. Beyond it lay the field that had belonged to Baron Crane. Daniel crouched down and scooped up a handful of soil. He rubbed it between his fingers, brought it to his nose. Alkaline, almost no organic matter. The structure was destroyed, 0 nitrogen. Classic. He'd seen soil like this dozens of times, in Nigeria, in India, in Mexico. Farmers would come to him with a handful of dead soil and ask if anything could be grown here, and every time he'd give the same answer. Yes, it's possible, but it takes time. It takes a plan. It takes the right steps in the right order. Here, he lacked everything: a thermometer, litmus paper, a laboratory. But he had the most important thing: 10 years of practical experience, a Cornell education, and a 999% growth bonus. He closed his eyes and mentally focused on the soil beneath his fingers. Something shifted inside him, as if an invisible thread had been stretched between his palm and the soil. A circle 2 meters in diameter. That was his limit for today. He felt it the way one feels the boundaries of one's own body. 2 meters, a tiny patch, but enough for a start. Daniel stood up and looked around. He needed ash, bone meal, manure, any organic matter. He walked back into the house and began examining the hearth. There was ash, a little. Hannah looked at him as if he were crazy when he started scooping the ash into a clay pot. He said he needed manure, any kind, chicken, cow, goat. Hannah replied that the cow had died in January, the chickens too. All that was left was goat manure from the neighbor's goat. Daniel asked if the neighbor would give him some manure. Hannah looked at him as if he'd asked for the moon. Then she said quietly that she'd try to talk to Mary. Mary Willow, the neighbor, a widow with a 6-year-old son. While Hannah was walking over to the neighbors, Daniel walked around the entire plot. 3 rows of turnips, pitiful, stunted plants with yellowed leaves. He crouched down and examined the roots. Nematodes. Root rot. These plants were doomed. But near the fence, he found something interesting. Wild clover. A small clump clinging to a stake. Clover is a legume. Legumes fix nitrogen from the air through bacteria in their roots. In his old world, any freshman knew that. Here, it was secret knowledge more valuable than gold. He found a few more clumps of wild clover in the ravine. He dug them up carefully with a clod of earth. He brought them back to the plot. Hannah returned with a small bucket of goat manure. Mary had given it to her for free. She said Hannah was having a hard enough time as it was. Daniel set to work. He mixed the ash with the manure. He added chopped turnip stalks. The result was a pitiful semblance of compost, but it would do for a start. He spread the mixture over that same circle with a diameter 2 meters in diameter. He planted clover in the center. He placed his palm on the ground and marked the spot. The sensation was strange. It was as if the earth sighed beneath his fingers. Warmth rose from the soil through his palm into his shoulder and spread throughout his body. Then fatigue set in, sudden, heavy, as if he'd been unloading a truckload of cement for several hours straight. Daniel pulled his hand away and sat down on the ground. He was shaking. Sweat was running down his back. 2 meters, a tiny circle, and he was already wrung out like a rag. He looked at the clover. Nothing visible was happening. The acceleration wasn't instantaneous. A 10-fold acceleration meant that what normally takes a week to grow would grow in half a day. What normally takes a month to grow would grow in 3 days. The clover would take root by evening. By tomorrow morning, it would start to grow. By the day after tomorrow, its root nodules would begin enriching the soil with nitrogen. In 4 days, this patch of ground would be fertile soil. Daniel lay down right in the furrow and closed his eyes. He lay between the sky and the earth, skinny, hungry, in a body that wasn't his own, in a world that wasn't his own, with a debt of 2 sacks of grain, with a sister dying of starvation, with a mother who looked at him as if he were a demon. And the only thing he had was the knowledge that clover fixes nitrogen. At that moment, he laughed, quietly, hoarsely. Lying in the mud. Because his whole life, 10 years of work in the fields, thousands of hours in laboratories, hundreds of farmers he'd advised, all of it came down to a single clump of wild clover and a bucket of goat manure. Hannah stepped out onto the porch and saw her son lying in the furrow laughing. She crossed herself and went back inside. Daniel lay there for another minute. Then he got up. He didn't have time to lie there. He needed to find seeds, any seeds. Fast-growing crops. Radishes sprout in 3 weeks. With his growth accelerator, that's 2 days. Turnips in 6 weeks. With the accelerator, 4 days. But he needed seeds. And seeds in this world cost money, which he didn't have. He remembered the grain loan system. In the spring, you take a bag of seeds. In the fall, you return 2. If you don't return them, the debt passes to your children. Perpetual slavery disguised as aid. Daniel clenched his teeth. He'd seen schemes like this in Kenya. Different names, same mechanism. He wouldn't take seeds from barren crane. So he'd have to look for wild plants, wild varieties, the ones that grow in ravines and on roadsides, the ones farmers consider weeds. He spent the rest of the day exploring the surrounding area, the ravine behind the plot, the edge of the forest half a kilometer away, the bank of a stream. He gathered everything he could find: wild carrots, lamb's quarters, sorrel, dandelions, stinging nettles, and plantain. Not for food, for the soil, for compost, for mulch. He also found clover and marked the spots where wild peas grew. He returned in the evening with an armful of greens. Kana looked at the stinging nettles and lamb's quarters in his hands and said that he could make a soup out of the stinging nettles. Daniel nodded. Some of the greens went into the pot. Some went into the compost pile he'd set up behind the house. The soup was bitter, watery, unsalted. Lily drank 2 cups and fell asleep. Hannah ate in silence. Daniel finished his portion and went outside to check on the clover. In the darkness, he couldn't make out the details, but he pressed his palm against the ground. Warm. Active. It's working. He returned to the house and lay down on the straw mattress. His body ached. His head was buzzing. Numbers swam before his eyes. 1/4 of an acre. 2 sacks of grain. 4 months. The calories needed for 3 people to survive. The minimum protein requirement for a child with kwashiorkor. The carbon-to-nitrogen ratio in the compost. The optimal temperature for wheat germination. He calculated and recalculated, over and over, until he fell asleep. In the morning, Daniel woke up before dawn. His body ached as if he'd run a marathon. He sat up on the mattress and took a few seconds to adjust to the darkness. Hannah and Lily were sleeping behind the partition. He quietly got up and went outside. The sky was gray. The cold spring air smelled of earth and smoke from the neighbors' fires. He walked over to his assigned plot and froze. The clover had grown. Overnight, it had shot up 10 centimeters. The leaves were thick, lush, bright green. Daniel crouched down and examined the roots. He carefully dug around the edge with his fingers. Nodules were already forming on the roots, little white beads. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria were at work. In 2 days, this small patch would be richer in nitrogen than the rest of the field. He stood up straight and looked around. No one had seen him. It was early morning. The village was still asleep. That was important. If anyone saw the clover that had grown overnight, questions would arise. Questions would lead to rumors. Rumors would lead to the priest. The priest would lead to the stake. In this world, a peasant who displayed unusual abilities ended up at the stake as a heretic, or in the dungeon of the Inquisition as a damned soul. Daniel remembered this clearly. Concealment was a matter of life and death. He gathered a bunch of lamb's quarters from yesterday's supply and covered the clover with it, sloppily, carelessly, as if he'd simply tossed the grass into the furrow. From a distance, it looked like a pile of trash. Perfect. He spent the next 2 hours in the ravine gathering wild peas. He found 7 bushes. He dug up 3, roots and all. He marked the rest. Peas are another legume, another source of nitrogen, but peas are also food, protein, exactly what Lily was lacking. He brought the peas back to the plot and planted them next to the clover in the marked-off circle. He placed his palm on the ground again. Once more, a wave of fatigue washed over his body, but it was weaker than yesterday. Either he was getting used to it, or Aiden's body had adapted. When he returned to the house, Khan was already up. She looked at his hands in the dirt and said nothing. Then she asked why he was bringing weeds into the garden. All normal people pull weeds, she said, but he was planting them. Daniel sat down on the threshold and tried to explain. He said that peas weren't weeds, that they were edible, that they were good for the soil. Hannah shook her head. She said that peas were poisonous. Everyone knew that. The priest had said that peas were a curse on the earth. Daniel closed his eyes. There it was. The first obstacle. Not the soil, not the climate, not the lack of tools. Superstition. In this world, half of all edible plants were considered poisonous or cursed. Potatoes were considered poison. Tomatoes were called bloodberries. Peas were the curse of the earth, and the priest confirmed it. Daniel thought of Kenya. There too were villages where local elders forbade the cultivation of certain crops for religious reasons. Back then, it had taken him half a year to convince one chief to try soybeans. Here, he didn't have half a year. He had 4 months and a hungry sister. He didn't argue with Hannah. Instead, he waited until evening. When it got dark, he went out to the fenced-off plot. The peas had already sprouted new shoots. The accelerator was working. He picked 3 young pods. He brought them into the house. He shelled the peas. He put 4 peas in his mouth and began to chew. Hannah watched him in horror. He chewed calmly. He swallowed. He waited a minute. He said he could see that he was alive and well, and that the peas weren't poisonous. Hannah didn't believe him. She said the poison didn't take effect immediately. Daniel nodded and said that in the morning she would see that he was alive. In the morning, he really was alive. What's more, he felt better than he had the day before. Protein. His body had gotten what it needed. Hannah stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long time. Then, silently, she held out her hand. Daniel placed 2 peas in her palm. She ate them quickly, almost furtively, as if she were afraid God would see. An hour later, she asked if she could give some to Lily. Daniel said yes. He gave her 4 peas, soft ones, young ones. Lily ate them and asked for more. It was the first protein she'd had in several weeks. By evening on the 3rd day, the peas in the fenced-off circle had grown into a full-fledged bush. The pods filled out one after another. Daniel harvested them twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. The family ate half, and he dried the other half for later. Hannah no longer spoke of the curse. Lily followed him everywhere. She was too weak to help, but she sat nearby while he worked and watched. Sometimes she asked questions. Why is the grass green? Why do flowers smell? Why do beetles eat leaves? Daniel answered, simply and briefly, just as he would have answered a child in his past life, if he'd had children. It was a strange feeling, the responsibility for a little person. He wasn't used to it. In his past life, he'd lived alone. He consulted with farmers. He traveled the world. No wife, no children. His mother would call every Sunday and ask when he was finally going to settle down. Now he had a 7-year-old sister who fell asleep holding onto his finger. On the 4th day, he expanded his plan. The fenced-off patch with clover and peas was working. The soil inside had darkened. It had become looser. It smelled different, like living earth, not dead dust. But 2 meters was too little. He needed more. He tried to secure a second plot next to the first, another circle 2 meters wide. He placed his palms on the ground and concentrated. The thread tightened. The earth sighed. And Daniel doubled over in pain. Pain shot through his spine. Heat surged into his head. He fell onto his side and lay there for 10 minutes, unable to move. 2 circles in 1 day was too much. His body couldn't take it. He lay there and looked up at the sky. Gray. Low. Clouds were rolling in from the west. It's going to rain. Good. Rain is moisture. Moisture is life. When he was able to get up, he wandered over to the stream. He washed his face, drank some water, sat on the bank for a while. A woman carrying a bucket walked by, a neighbor, Mary Willow, the same one who'd given him the goat manure. She stopped and looked at him, asked how he was feeling, said that Hannah was worried. She said her son had been acting strange since his illness. Daniel said he was fine. It's just that his mind works differently after a fever. Mary nodded. Then she paused and quietly said that her son Thomas was sick. A fever. It's been 4 days. The fever won't break. The herbalist is a 3-day walk away. That. She said it in an even voice. No tears, no pleading. The voice of someone who had already prepared herself to lose her child. Daniel looked at her. She was about 30. She looked 45. Her hands were red from work. Her eyes were dry. She had already cried her fill. He asked what herbs grew behind her house. Mary didn't understand the question. He went with her. Behind her house stood a crooked fence. Beyond the fence was a ravine. In the ravine, among the weeds, he found what he was looking for: yarrow, chamomile, elderberry, and something else. A short plant with silvery leaves and small purple flowers. He didn't recognize it right away. Then he remembered. In his world, the closest relative of this plant was called medicinal sage. Here, they called it silver star. It cost a gold piece per ounce in the capital's pharmacies, and it grew here like a weed behind the widow's house. Daniel crouched down and examined the plant. Small, withered, but alive. He needed 3 hours. He told Mary to bring hot water, a clean rag, and a clay pot. Mary didn't ask why, she just went. Daniel packed down the soil around the plant. The accelerator kicked in. Fatigue washed over him again, the 3rd time in 2 days. He was shaking, sweat was pouring off him, but he kept his hand on the soil and waited. An hour later, the plant straightened up. After 2 hours, the leaves grew larger, more vibrant. The silvery hue deepened. 3 hours later, a full-grown silver starbush stood before him. Daniel plucked the leaves, rubbed them between his hands. The scent was strong, clean, camphor-like with a hint of honey. He recalled the properties of sage: antiseptic, fever-reducing, anti-inflammatory. Mary brought everything he'd asked for. He prepared the decoction himself, using exact proportions: a handful of leaves to a mug of water. Boil for 3 minutes, no more. Let it steep for 5 minutes. Strain it through a cloth. They went into Mary's house. The boy was lying on straw. Small, 6 years old. His face was red from the fever. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Daniel lifted his head and poured the decoction down his throat. Warm, not hot. The boy drank and coughed. Daniel held his head and waited. Mary stood by the wall. Her hands were clasped in front of her chest so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. By evening, the boy had fallen asleep peacefully. His breathing had evened out. The fever began to subside. By morning, his temperature was almost normal. Mary stood over her sleeping son, unable to speak. Then she turned to Daniel and began to sink to her knees. He caught her by the hands and lifted her up. He said that she shouldn't be bowing to him, but to the elderberry bush and the silver star behind her house. Then he said the most important thing. He asked her not to tell anyone that he was the one who had helped. He explained it simply. If people found out that he knew about herbs, people would come, from the baron or from the church. They'd take him away. And then there would be no one left to help. Mary looked into his eyes for a long time. Then she nodded. Not a single word more. She understood. She understood not only what he had said, but also he hadn't said. That he was different, that something had happened to him, that it wasn't her business, that only one thing mattered. Her son was alive. Daniel returned home. Hannah was asleep. Lily was asleep. He lay down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. His body was trembling with exhaustion. 3 missions in 2 days. It was too much. He wouldn't be able to work tomorrow. Maybe the day after tomorrow either. But today he'd accomplished 3 things. He'd planted a nitrogen-fixing crop. He'd fed his family protein. He'd saved a child. 3 things in 2 days. In his past life, he would have drawn up 40 pages of project documents just for that. Here, he simply got up and did it, with his hands, in the dirt, on his knees. And for the first time in both of his lifetimes, he felt that he was doing exactly what he was born to do. For 2 days, Daniel lay sprawled on the mattress. Fever, weakness, muscle aches like with a severe flu. Aiden's body refused to cooperate. Hannah gave him herbal tea and nettle soup. Lily sat beside him and placed a wet cloth on his forehead. It was a strange feeling. A 7-year-old girl was caring for him with the seriousness of an adult nurse. She changed the cloth every half hour. She brought him water. She whispered that everything would be all right. Daniel lay there and thought. Not about the soil, not about the plants. About her. About Lily. In his past life, he hadn't had children. He'd had a career. He'd had business trips. He'd had an apartment in Des Moines where he'd go once a month to pick up his mail and water his cactus. His mother would call on Sundays. His sister would send photos of his niece. He'd reply with emojis and promise to come home for Christmas. He never did. Now he had Lily, 7 years old, her belly swollen from protein malnutrition, her arms as thin as sticks, her eyes serious and huge on her small face. And she'd hold on to his finger as she fell asleep. He didn't deserve that trust. He wasn't her brother. He was a stranger in a stolen body. But her fingers tightened around his hand, and he realized it didn't matter. She didn't know. To her, he was Aiden, the older brother who had suddenly become someone else, stronger, smarter. He started doing strange things, but he was still her brother. And Daniel decided, not with his mind, but with something deeper, that he would be her brother, for real, as long as he lived. On the 3rd day, he got up. He still felt weak, but he could work. He went out to the plot. The clover in the first fenced-in circle had grown to 1/2 meter, thick, lush. Its roots had permeated the soil with a network of tubercles. The peas had produced a second wave of pods. The second circle, which he'd secured with such difficulty, was also thriving. The wild carrots he'd transplanted there had sprouted green shoots. In total, he had 2 circles, each 2 meters in diameter. 4 square meters of fertile soil amid a barren wasteland. A drop in the ocean. He needed to scale up. But he couldn't secure more than 1 plot a day without risking another collapse. So he needed a strategy. Daniel sat down on the threshold and began to think. He had one goal. 2 sacks of grain by fall, 120 kilograms of wheat. With his accelerator, 1 wheat cycle took not 4 months, but 12 days. Theoretically, he could harvest 10 crops per season, but he needed space. He couldn't grow 120 kilograms on 4 square meters. He needed at least 30 square meters of secured land. That's 15 cycles, 15 allotted circles, 15 days if he did 1 per day. And that's assuming he had wheat seeds, but he didn't have any seeds. He looked at the stunted rows of turnips outside the allotted circles, withered turnips on barren soil. But the turnips produced seeds, small ones, dark ones. He could gather them and use them as seed money. Not for planting, for bartering. There were 23 houses in the village. Someone was bound to have wheat seeds, even if only a little, even if they were of poor quality. He needed at least a handful. He could grow his first crop from them, select the best grains, plant them again. The second generation would be better than the first, the third even better. Real-time selection. What took years in his world would take weeks here. Daniel got up and walked through the village. Meadowbrook consisted of 23 houses scattered along a dirt road, if you could even call it a road. Ruts in the clay, puddles, mud. The houses were just like rows: clay, wood, straw, half-ruined fences, scrawny goats, skinny dogs. The people didn't look any better. Gray faces, sunken eyes. 3 out of 10, it was a bad harvest year. This was the third in a row. Wheat blight had destroyed half the crops in the north. The village was dying, slowly, quietly. No screams or riots. People were simply growing weaker. The children had stopped growing. The old people lay down and didn't get up. He walked past Mary Willow's house. He heard a child's laughter coming from behind the door. Thomas. The boy was getting better. Mary was standing by the fence, watching Daniel. She nodded silently. He nodded back. He walked on. The fourth house from the edge, an old man named Bran. Daniel knew him from fragments of Aiden's memory. No, not memories. Aiden's memories hadn't been transferred, but for some reason he knew the names. Maybe the system had fed him some basic information. Bran was the oldest person in the village. He was 53 years old. He looked 70. Daniel approached his house and called out. Bran was sitting on his doorstep, mending a holy basket. He looked at Daniel with cloudy eyes. He asked what Daniel wanted. Daniel said he wanted to trade a turnip for some wheat seeds. Bran snorted. He said he had wheat seeds, but they were rotten, last year's. Half of them won't sprout. Daniel said those would be fine. Bran looked at him suspiciously. He asked why he needed rotten seeds. A normal person would borrow good seeds from the Baron. Daniel replied that he didn't want to borrow from the Baron. Bran fell silent. Then he nodded slowly. He said that made sense, that the Baron had already taken half the village, that soon he'd take the other half too. He went into the house and returned with a rag bundle, a handful of wheat seeds, 200 grams. Small, shriveled, some with spots of rot. Daniel examined each grain. He discarded a third of them. He set aside the healthy ones, about 130 grams of usable grain. Not much, but enough. He handed Bran a bunch of pea pods. Bran looked at them as if they were poisonous snakes. Daniel said they weren't poisonous and that he ate them himself every day. Bran cautiously picked up a pod. He sniffed it. He bit into a single pea. He chewed it. He swallowed it. He thought for a moment. He said it tasted good, but was probably cursed anyway. Daniel said that if God wanted to kill him, he wouldn't have made the poison taste good. Bran thought about that. Then he grunted and took all the pods. For the next 5 days, Daniel worked according to plan. Every morning, he secured 1 new circle, 2 meters. He didn't risk going any further. After securing it, he rested for an hour. Then he worked with his hands. He prepared the soil. He added compost. The compost pile behind the house was growing. He added everything he could find to it: nettles, lamb's quarters, leaves, kitchen scraps, and the goat manure that Mary now gave him every day for free, no questions asked. By the 10th day, he had 7 circles secured, 14 square meters. He planted wheat in the first 4 circles. The seeds were weak. Half of them didn't sprout, just as Bran had warned. But the ones that did sprout grew at a frenzied pace. In 3 days, they put out their first leaves. In 5, they reached knee height. By the 8th day, the ears of wheat began to form. Daniel walked among the circles and selected the strongest stalks, the largest ears, and the healthiest grains, the first generation. Weak, uneven, but alive. He harvested his first microcrop on the 12th day, a handful of grains, about 500 grams. He replanted the best grains, the second generation. And at the same time, he prepared new circles. The work was monotonous, hard, repetitive. Secure the soil, fertilize, plant, water, wait, harvest, sort, plant again, and again, and again. Hannah helped, silently. She saw that wheat was growing from soil that had previously yielded nothing. She didn't understand how, but she saw it, and she stopped asking questions. Once she said that the soil had started to smell different. Daniel nodded. The soil really did smell different, like living soil, like the best fields he'd seen in Iowa. Dark, crumbly, full of worms. Mary came every day. She brought goat manure, sometimes milk for Lily. Her goat was skinny but still produced milk. Daniel never asked for milk. Mary just brought it. She'd set it on the doorstep, then she'd leave. One day she came and brought another woman with her, a neighbor from the other end of the village. The woman was holding the hand of a girl of about 4 with swollen legs. Mary said the child had had a fever for a week. Daniel looked at Mary. She looked away. He'd asked her not to tell anyone, but she couldn't help herself. The child was dying. Daniel could have been angry, but he wasn't. He nodded and went to the ravine to look for the silver star. The bush he'd grown near Mary's house was still there. New leaves had sprouted. He gathered them and prepared a decoction. 2 days later, the girl came too. Now 2 people knew about him, then 3, then 5. Mary became the go-between. People came to her. She said the herbs were hers, her knowledge. From her grandmother. Daniel supplied her with the materials. She distributed them. The system worked. No one knew he was the one behind Mary. Not yet, anyway. By the end of the 3rd week, Daniel had established 12 circles, 24 square meters. The 3rd generation of wheat was noticeably better than the first. The grains were larger, the stalks were sturdier, the ears were fuller. The breeding program was working. 2 more generations, and he'd have a variety capable of withstanding the northern soil. He stood on the plot that evening, looking at his circles. 12 green patches in the middle of the gray earth. Beautiful. Bright. Too bright. He remembered the limitation. Plants grown with the accelerator had a slightly brighter color, a slightly stronger scent. An ordinary farmer wouldn't notice, but if anyone from Baron Crane's entourage came by and saw 12 emerald circles on a barren plot, questions would be inevitable. He needed to cover it up. Tomorrow, first thing in the morning. Camouflage was a simple task for a man who had spent 10 years working in countries where displaying wealth meant being robbed by morning. In Kenya, the farmers he advised hid their bountiful harvests behind fences of thorny shrubs. In Mexico, small-scale marijuana growers camouflaged their plantations among cornfields. Principle number 1. Make it look like everyone else's from the outside. Daniel spent 2 days on it. First, he gathered dead grass and dry stalks from the roadside and spread them between the secured hoops. From a distance, the plot looked like a weed-choked wasteland with sparse green patches. Not emerald circles, but specifically patches, irregular, chaotic, as if a few seeds had accidentally sprouted in favorable spots. Second, he transplanted some wild grass and pigweed to the edges of the circles to blur the sharp boundaries. Third, he built a shed out of old planks and poles over the 2 most productive circles. Not a greenhouse, just a shed, supposedly for drying hay. In reality, to hide the rapid growth from prying eyes. Fourth, and most importantly, he moved the most important work to the old barn. The barn stood 20 paces from the house. It was half ruined. The roof had caved in at one end. The walls were made of clay and stone. The door hung by a single hinge. Kana said her father used to keep his tools there before he got sick. After that, the barn was abandoned. Daniel inspected the structure. The walls were sturdy. The foundation was stone. The roof could be repaired. 2 days' work. He repaired the roof. He filled the cracks in the walls with clay mixed with straw. He hung the door on both hinges. Inside the barn, it was dark and dry. The area was about 20 square meters. Perfect. He moved some of the compost here. He spread a layer of soil over the stone floor. He compacted it. Here, the growth accelerator worked just as it did in the open field. The soil breathed and responded to his touch. In the barn, he could grow anything he wanted without prying eyes. The first thing he planted inside was a silver star, 6 bushes, from seeds he'd collected from the plant behind Mary's house. In 10 days with the accelerator, they'd reach maturity. In 20 days, they'd produce seeds. In a month, he'd have a small plantation of a medicinal plant that cost a gold piece per ounce in the capital. The second thing he planted was wild onions. He found them on the bank of a stream, tiny bulbs, pungent, fragrant. Onions are vitamin C. Onions are an antiseptic. Onions are a seasoning. In a world where spices cost more than silver, even wild onions had value. The third were wild mustard seeds, tiny, pungent. The mustard grew like crazy. With the growth accelerator, a single bush produced seeds in 4 days. Mustard seeds could be ground and sold as a seasoning. Oil could be pressed from them. They could be used to make compresses for colds. He worked in the barn every evening after sunset. During the day, he tended to the open field. The wheat was in its 4th generation. The grains had grown larger. The stalks were sturdier. He began to notice signs of resistance to northern blight. The plants he had selected, generation after generation, resisted the disease better than the starting material from bran. The breeding program was working. 5 weeks later, he did something no breeder in the history of this world had ever done. He bred a 5th generation of wheat that was immune to northern rot. The grains were golden, heavy. Each ear bore 40 grains instead of the usual 20. The yield was twice the standard. He stood in the barn and held an ear in the palm of his hand. Lily stood beside him. She would sneak into the barn to be with him every evening. She'd sit in a corner and watch. She didn't get in the way. She was just there. That evening, she asked what it was. Daniel said it was wheat. Lily said wheat wasn't like that. Wheat is small and gray. This one is yellow and big. Daniel smiled. He said it was a new kind of wheat, better than the old one. You can bake bread with it, white and soft. Lily quietly asked, "What's white bread?" Daniel fell silent. She didn't know. She had never eaten white bread in her life, only gray porridge made from crushed grain, sometimes flatbreads made from bran. He clenched the ear of wheat in his hand. The 6th week. The first sack of wheat was almost ready. The harvest from the assigned fields, plus the early grain from the granary, had yielded him about 60 kilograms of excellent wheat. Half the debt. 3 more weeks and he'd fill the 2nd sack. By midsummer, the debt would be paid off, with room to spare. But it was precisely at that moment that the first problem arose. Not from the Baron, not from the church, from the neighbors. Old man Bran came by in the morning. He stood by the fence. He looked at Daniel's plot for a long time, saying nothing. Then he said one sentence. He said the young man's land was greener than anyone else's. Daniel replied calmly. He said he used fertilizer, manure, and ash, nothing special. Bran shook his head. He said everyone had manure and ash, but only Roe had green land. Then he left. Daniel stood there watching him go. The first bell rang. Bran wasn't a mean man. He was observant. 53 years of life on this land. He knew every furrow, every stone, every shade of soil. And he saw that Roe's plot had changed. Too quickly, too drastically. Daniel reviewed his camouflage. He reinforced it. He added more dead grass between the circles. He dug up part of the compacted soil to hide the boundaries. He stopped watering the open circles during the day, only in the evening and at night. But Bran wasn't the only problem. 2 days later, a wagon pulled up to the house. Sitting in the wagon was a man in a leather vest with a badge on his chest. Baron Crane's tax collector. His name was Reed. Skinny, long nose, small eyes. He came every month. He checked who owed taxes. He made lists. Reed got off the wagon and walked around the plot. He looked at the wheat. He touched an ear of wheat. He twirled it between his fingers. Then he looked at Daniel. He asked where he'd gotten such grain. Daniel said he'd bought the seeds from a traveling merchant on the road. Reed asked which merchant. Daniel described a man who didn't exist, bearded, wearing a gray hat, heading south. Reed jotted that something in his notebook. Then he asked when Roe was going to pay his debt. Daniel said he'd pay by the end of summer, in full, 2 sacks. Reed snorted. He said the Baron didn't like to wait. If there was no grain by the deadline, the house and the plot would become the Baron's property. Then he got into his wagon and drove off. Daniel stood there watching the dust from the wheels. Reed had seen the grain. He'd touched an ear of wheat. And something flashed in his small eyes. Not suspicion. Greed. This grain was different, better than anything he'd seen in the area, and Reed realized it. That meant Crane would find out soon. He had to speed things up. Daniel worked almost non-stop for the next 3 weeks. He planted 2 circles a day. He paid for it with headaches and chills in the evenings. Hannah made him drink hot herbal tea and go to bed. He'd lie down. He'd lie there for an hour. Then he'd get up and go to the barn. The wheat in the barn grew in cycles, 12 days until harvest. He harvested 1 cycle. He threshed it by hand. He winnowed it in the wind. He poured the grain into burlap sacks that Hannah had sewn from old rags. By the end of the 2nd month, he had 2.5 sacks of wheat, 150 kilograms. He could pay off the debt. And he did. On the morning of the 8th week, Daniel loaded the 2 sacks onto a wooden wheelbarrow and took them to the Baron's house. Crane's estate stood 3 kilometers from the village. A stone house, 2 stories, a tiled roof. By Meadowbrook standards, it was a palace. Daniel stopped at the gate. 2 sacks of grain, 120 kilograms, the Rowe family's debt. He waited at the gate for half an hour. Then the steward came out, an elderly man with a mustache. He looked at the sacks, untied one, scooped up a handful of grain, looked at it, sniffed it, poured it back in. Then he opened the 2nd sack. Same thing. The steward was silent for a long time. Then he said the grain was good, very good, the best he'd seen all year. He asked where it came from. Daniel repeated the story about the traveling merchant. The manager nodded. He went into the house. 15 minutes later, he returned with a receipt. The Rowe family's debt was settled, in full. Daniel took the receipt. He looked at it, crooked letters on yellow paper, Baron Crane's seal. He folded the receipt and tucked it into his shirt front. He turned and headed back. Halfway to the village, he stopped. He sat down on the side of the road and sat there for 10 minutes, just sitting, just breathing. 2 months. 2 sacks of grain. The debt was paid off. The family wouldn't lose their home. Lily wouldn't end up on the street. He stood up and continued on his way. A plan for the next month was already forming in his head. Daniel spent the 1st month after paying off his debt on 3 things: supplies, expansion, people. Supplies were the top priority. He divided the 20 kilograms of wheat left over after paying off the debt into 3 parts: 5 kilograms for food, 5 for seeds for the next harvest, 10 for bartering. Bartering in the village was simple. Wheat was the currency. For 1 kilogram of good grain, you could get a bucket of milk, 2 kilograms of goat cheese, a dozen eggs, or a service, fixing a roof, sharpening a tool, borrowing a horse for a day. Daniel began trading grain for what he needed: tools, nails, rope, oiled cloth, and clay pots. He planned each trade in advance. He never traded too much at once. He never showed that he had more than one person needed. Little by little, unobtrusively, like a stream that wears away a stone. Expanding the barn was his second priority. By the end of the 3rd month, 6 designated plots were in operation inside the barn. The silver star yielded a steady harvest of leaves every 10 days. The wild onions had multiplied to 30 bulbs. The mustard produced seeds continuously. And most importantly, in the far corner of the barn stood 4 clay pots filled with soil, in which grew what Daniel considered his trump card: tomatoes. He'd found them by chance during the 3rd week. A small bush with tiny green berries was growing in a ditch by the road. The peasants called it bloodgrass. They thought it was poisonous. They gave it a wide berth. Daniel recognized it at first glance. A wild tomato. Small, bitter, but a tomato nonetheless. He dug up the plant and brought it to the barn. He planted it in a pot. He staked it. 2 weeks later, the bush had grown to half a meter and produced its first red fruits. Small, about the size of a cherry, but red, juicy, sweet and sour. Daniel tasted one. The flavor was a far cry from the tomatoes he'd eaten in Iowa, but it was a tomato, a real one, a living one, and it could be improved. He began breeding them. The first generation, small and bitter. He selected the largest fruits. He planted the seeds. The second generation appeared 12 days later, slightly larger, slightly sweeter. The third generation, the 4th, 5th. By the middle of the 3rd month, he had tomatoes the size of a walnut. Red, juicy, sweet. Not perfect, but edible. He gave one to Lily. She turned it over in her hands. She sniffed it. She took a careful bite, chewed slowly. Then her eyes widened. She asked what it was. Daniel said it was called a tomato. Lily said it was the most delicious thing she'd ever eaten. Then she asked for more. Hannah tried one cautiously. She ate half of it. She sat there. She waited. Then she finished the second one. And for the first time in 3 months, she smiled. Not at Daniel, at the tomato. But Daniel took it as a personal victory. People were his 3rd priority. After the debt was paid off, his status in the village changed. The Rows were debtors, the poorest family in Meadowbrook. A boy without a father, a mother and sister on the brink of starvation. And suddenly this boy comes along and pays the debt, in full, with grain that's better than the Barons. The village began to talk, not loudly, in whispers, behind closed doors. Some were jealous, some were in awe, some were afraid. Bran walked around the village saying that the Row boy was strange, that his land was greener, that the peas he ate were cursed. But he immediately added that the peas were delicious, and that the boy didn't seem to have died. Mary Willow remained silent, just as he'd asked, but her silence spoke volumes. Everyone knew Thomas had been sick. Everyone saw that Thomas was healthy. Everyone knew Mary went to see Row every day. No one asked, but everyone wondered. Daniel knew this couldn't last much longer. Sooner or later, someone would ask. Someone would spill the beans. Someone would snitch. He needed allies, not secret ones, open ones. People who would have a stake in his success. People who would benefit from protecting him. Bran was the first, not because the old man was the best candidate, but because he already knew too much. Better to make him a partner than to leave him as an observer. Daniel went to see him that evening. He sat down on the threshold of his house and offered a deal. Daniel would give him seeds of his new wheat for free. Bran would plant them on his plot. Daniel would show him how to fertilize and when to water. They'd split the harvest 50-50, half for Bran, half for Daniel. Bran listened in silence. Then he asked why. Daniel told the truth, partially. He said he couldn't manage it alone, that he needed people. That if Bran had a good harvest, then the collector Reed would be less interested in Roe's plot, and that if they worked together, it would be harder for the Baron to take everything away from them. Bran thought for a long time. He sat in silence for about 10 minutes, staring into the darkness. Then he said one sentence. He said the boy spoke like an old man, not like an 18-year-old good-for-nothing. Daniel replied that hunger makes you grow old. Bran chuckled. He held out his hand. They sealed the deal with a handshake. The next day, Daniel brought Bran a small bag of seeds, 6th-generation wheat, the best he had. He showed Bran how to prepare the soil. He explained about ash and manure, about watering, about how weeds need to be pulled, but not all of them. Leave the clover. Bran listened and crossed himself every 3 sentences. When Daniel said that the soil needs to be nourished like a wife, and that if you plant wheat every year, the soil will get tired, Bran crossed himself twice and asked him not to mention his late wife. But he took the seeds and planted them that very day. 2 weeks later, neat rows of wheat were sprouting on Bran's plot, without any growth accelerators, on ordinary soil. But with the right seeds and the right farming techniques, the yield was 1.5 times higher than his neighbors. Not 10 times higher like Daniel's, but 1.5 times. And that made sense. Good seeds, proper care, no magic. Bran stood in front of his wheat and shook his head. Then he turned to Daniel and said that if he showed this to the others, half the village would follow him. Daniel said that was exactly what he intended to do. The Han family became his second ally. They were neighbors, 2 houses down. Han's father had died of an illness 3 months earlier. His mother was left behind along with 4 children. The eldest daughter was Yuna, 19 years old. She held the family together just as Bran had held his, only she was 19, not 53. Daniel had noticed her before. Every morning she went out to the fields before anyone else. She worked until dark. She carried water from the stream in 2 buckets on a yoke. She dug, she sowed, she weeded, silently, without complaint, without tears, her face as hard as a wall. He approached her one afternoon. She straightened up and looked at him. Her eyes were dark, wary. She wasn't beautiful in the usual sense. Broad cheekbones, weather-beaten lips, hands calloused from work. But there was something about her. Strength. The kind of strength that keeps people on their feet when everyone around them is falling. He offered her the same deal he'd offered Branu. Seeds. Knowledge. A 50-50 split of the harvest. Yuna didn't answer right away. She asked why he needed this. Daniel said the same thing he'd told Branu, that one person couldn't manage it alone. Yuna shook her head. She said he was lying, that no one gives away seeds for nothing, that there must be something behind it. Daniel looked at her. She was smart. Too smart for a 19-year-old peasant girl who had never left the village. He told her the second truth. He said he needed someone who knew how to count, someone who could keep records, someone who wouldn't cheat. Yuna stared at him without blinking. Then she asked why a peasant would need to keep records. Daniel said he didn't plan on being a peasant his whole life. Yuna was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she'd take the seeds, and that she knew how to count. Not as well as city folks, but she could do it. Her father had taught her. He was the only literate person in the village. Daniel remembered that. A literate farmer. A rarity. An interesting family. The following week, Yuna came to see him in the barn. Without warning, she just opened the door and walked in. Daniel was standing over the pots of tomatoes. Yuna froze in the doorway. She looked at the greenery inside the barn, at the wheat, at the onions, at the silver star, at the tomato plants with their red fruits. Then she looked at Daniel for a long time. He was waiting for a question, waiting for an accusation, waiting for fear. Yuna said one sentence. She said that now she understood why he needed to keep records. Daniel exhaled. She wasn't scared. She didn't run to the priest. She didn't scream about witchcraft. She saw the big picture, and the first thing she thought about wasn't magic, it was a logistics. He pulled a tomato out of the pot and held it out to her. Yuna took it, took a bite, chewed. Then she said she didn't know what it was, but it could fetch a lot of money. Daniel laughed. For the first time in 3 months, he laughed not out of despair, but out of joy. Because standing before him was a person who thought just like he did. Not about a miracle, about business. He told her it was a tomato, that they'd never seen anything like it in the capital, that if marketed right, a single tomato could sell for a silver coin. Yuna didn't bat an eye. She asked how many tomatoes he could grow in a month. Daniel said not many yet, but there would be more soon. Yuna nodded. Then she said she needed some paper and something to write with. She was going to do the math. That evening, they sat in the barn until midnight. Yuna scratched at a clay tablet with a stick. Daniel dictated the numbers, how many tomato plants he could grow, how many days until harvest, how many fruits per plant, how much a silver coin was worth in terms of wheat. Yuna calculated quickly, faster than he'd expected. When she finished, she looked at him and said that if everything was correct, in 6 months, he would be able to buy out her family's plot of land. Daniel said that was exactly what he intended to do, but not to take it away, to buy it out, and to let the Han family continue working the land, as partners. Yuna looked at him for a very long time. Then she quietly asked what he himself wanted. Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought for a moment. Then he said he wanted Lily to never go hungry again, and that to do that, he needed the whole village. Yuna nodded. She stood up. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she turned around. She said she'd come back tomorrow, and that she needed one more sign, a bigger one. The door closed. Daniel sat alone in the barn. Tomatoes, wheat, and a silver star grew all around him. Lily was sleeping behind the wall. 2 houses away, old Bran was tending his crops. At the other end of the village, Mary Willow was handing out medicinal herbs in the name of her late grandmother. And somewhere 3 kilometers from here, Baron Crane's steward had surely already reported to his master about the unusual grain from the Rowe family. A clock was ticking, one he didn't have. Daniel lay down on the straw and closed his eyes. The 3rd month. The debt was paid off. The family was fed. Allies had been found. His first partner was by his side. The 4th month lay ahead, and he knew it would be harder. Because until now, he had been fighting the land and hunger. But now he would have to fight people. The 4th month began with rain. Cold, lingering rain. The sky over Meadowbrook was shrouded in a gray veil that wouldn't lift for 2 weeks. The dirt road had turned into a river of mud. The stream had burst its banks and flooded 3 houses at the lower end of the village. Daniel stood in the doorway of the barn and watched the rain. In a past life, he would have been happy. Moisture is life. But here, an excess of water was just as dangerous as a drought. The circles he'd staked out in the open field were being washed away. The soil he'd spent 3 months restoring was flowing in little streams down the slope. He needed drainage, furrows to channel the water away, mulch to protect the topsoil, and extra hands because he couldn't keep up on his own. Yuna arrived in the morning, soaked to the bone. Behind her walked her 2 younger brothers, 10 and 12 years old, skinny, quiet, but strong. Yuna said they'd come to help. Daniel didn't refuse. He assigned tasks. The boys dug drainage ditches. Yuna covered the garden beds with straw and dry grass. Daniel reinforced new sections where the old ones had been washed away. By evening, they were filthy from head to toe, but the plot was saved. The boys each got a bowl of pea soup. Yuna stayed behind and helped move the tomato seedlings from the flooded corner of the barn to a dry one. They worked in silence. Daniel handed her the pots. She placed them on the shelves he'd cobbled together from old planks. At one point, their hands brushed against each other on a wet clay pot. Una pulled her hand away, quickly, almost as if she were startled. Daniel pretended not to notice. Then she left. The rain continued for another week. During that time, two things happened. The first was good. The silver star in the barn had produced seeds, lots of them. Daniel gathered them up and counted them. 240 seeds. Each seed is a potential bush. Each bush yields enough leaves for 5 or 6 decoctions. Each decoction is worth a silver coin if sold through a middleman. 240 bushes is more than 1,000 silver coins in a year, if he can find a market. The second piece of news was bad. Bran arrived in the evening, wet, angry. He sat down on the barn threshold and said a new man had shown up in the village, a laborer. He'd been hired by Farmer Glenn on the other side of Meadowbrook. He says he came from the south. He's looking for work in exchange for food and a roof over his head. Bran said he didn't believe him, that the laborer was too clean, that his hands weren't those of a farmer, that he was asking questions, lots of questions, about the harvest, about the neighbors, about the Rowe family. Daniel listened and felt a chill spread through him. A spy. Baron Crane's first spy. He'd been expecting this. He knew that sooner or later Crane would send someone, but he hadn't thought it would happen so quickly. It had been only 2 weeks since the debt was paid off. The steward had reported on the quality of the grain. Crane took an interest. He sent a man. Logical, predictable, and dangerous. Daniel asked Bran what the worker's name was. Bran said the man had introduced himself as Call. Daniel nodded. He asked Bran to keep an eye on him, not to get too close, not to talk to him, just to watch where he went and who he spoke with. Bran left. Daniel bolted the barn door shut. He sat in the darkness among his plants and thought. A spy isn't a disaster. A spy is a challenge. In Kenya, when local officials sent inspectors to the farms he was advising, Daniel knew what to do. Showed just enough not to arouse suspicion. No more, no less. A poor farmer who's just a little better off than the others, that's normal. A farmer with a barn full of crops no one has ever seen, that's a problem. So the barn needs to be hidden. Not physically, it can't be moved, but it can be made to look empty. Daniel spent 2 days building a false wall inside the barn out of old planks and clay. The wall divided the barn in half. The front part looked like an ordinary abandoned shed. Old tools, empty sacks, dust, cobwebs. The back part, behind the wall, was his laboratory. Tomatoes, silver star, wheat, onions, mustard. The entrance to the back section was through a narrow passageway that was covered by a plank disguised as part of the wall. Una helped, without asking why. She could tell he was nervous. She could tell he'd become more cautious. He locked the barn with a bolt. He went out to check the road before going inside. Once she asked him directly. She asked who he was afraid of. Daniel told the truth. The Baron. Una nodded. She said the Baron had taken their neighbor's land last year. The family had left for the city. No one had heard from them since. The city was Greenford, the county seat, a 3-day journey. For a peasant family with no money and no trade, the town meant only one thing: poverty, begging, and death. Daniel clenched his teeth. A week later, he saw Call, a short man in his 30s, light brown hair, a neat beard. Indeed, too clean for a wandering laborer. Hands without calluses, attentive eyes. Call was standing by the well, talking to Glenn's wife, laughing, helping her carry the bucket. Charming, pleasant, professional. Daniel walked past without stopping, didn't even glance in his direction. That evening, Bran reported. Call had been walking around the village all day. He stopped by the fields, asked about the harvest, inquired about grain prices. And he walked past the row house twice, slowly, looking around. Daniel decided to take action, not to hide, to take action. The next morning, he went out to his open plot and began working conspicuously. He dug, he weeded, he watered the stunted turnip he'd deliberately left there as a prop. He looked like an ordinary farmhand, dirty, sweaty, poor. Carl showed up an hour later. He approached the fence, said hello, introduced himself, said he was Glenn's new worker, that he was looking to make some connections, that he'd heard young Roe was a good farmer. Daniel feigned embarrassment, said he wasn't good, that he'd just gotten lucky with the seeds. A traveling salesman had sold him some good ones. Carl asked which salesman. Daniel repeated the description. Bearded, gray hat. He was heading south. Carl nodded and smiled. Then he looked at the field, at the stunted turnips, at the weeds between the rows, at the crooked fence, and a flash of disappointment crossed his eyes. He'd expected to see a miracle. Instead, he saw mud and poverty. All right. Daniel offered him some water. Carl refused. He left. Bran watched from behind his fence. That evening he came over and said the guy had played his part well. Daniel replied that it wasn't a game, that he really was a poor farmer with stunted turnips. It's just that he also had a barn that no one should know about. Carl stayed in the village for another 3 weeks. He walked around, he looked, he asked questions. Daniel behaved impeccably. He worked in the open field during the day. He only went into the barn at night. Una brought water and compost through the back door that Daniel had cut through the wall on the ravine side, unnoticed, quietly. After 3 weeks, Carl disappeared. He left just as suddenly as he had appeared. Bran said he saw him at dawn with a sack on his shoulders, walking along the road south, toward Crane's estate. Daniel exhaled. Round 1 won. Carl would report to the Baron that there was nothing special about Roe's place, a scrawny turnip, a poor plot of land, just a one-time stroke of luck with the seeds. That would buy him some time. He didn't know how much, maybe a month, maybe 2. Then Crane would send someone smarter, or come himself. He had to make the most of the time. Daniel turned his attention to trading. The Silver Star was ready, 20 mature bushes in the barn. The leaves were drying on ropes hanging from the ceiling. The scent was thick, camphor-like, honey-sweet. Each bundle of dried leaves weighed about an ounce, a gold coin per ounce in the capital. But the capital was far away, and Daniel was a peasant Yanin with no papers, no horse, and no right to leave the Baron's lands without permission. He needed a middleman. Mary Willow solved this problem, or rather her late grandmother did. Mary explained that once every 2 months, an itinerant herbalist passed through Meadowbrook, an old man named Velan. He buys wild herbs from the peasants, pays with copper, sometimes with silver, resells them in the cities. Daniel asked Mary to let him know when Velan showed up. She nodded. Velan showed up 10 days later, a small, gaunt old man with a cart loaded with sacks and bundles of herbs. His eyes were sharp as a hawk's. His hands were stained with plant dyes. He walked along the road, stopping at every house. He bought whatever they offered, stinging nettles, chamomile, plantain, trifles. Mary met him at her house. They talked. Then she led him to Daniel. Not to the house, to the barn, through the back door. Velan walked in and froze. He looked at the silver star bushes. He walked over, plucked a leaf, rubbed it between his fingers, sniffed it. His face changed. His sharp eyes grew even sharper. He turned to Daniel and said that it was a silver star, a real one, of the highest quality. He asked where it came from. Daniel said he'd found wild bushes in the mountains to the south. He'd brought them back and grown them. Velan looked at him for a long time. Then he said that the silver star doesn't grow on the plains, only in the mountains, only at a certain altitude, only in a certain kind of soil. But here it grows in a barn, in clay pots, and better than in the mountains. Daniel was silent. Velan was silent too. Then the old man sat down on an upside-down bucket and said he didn't care how, that all he cared about was how much. Daniel named his price, half the capital's rate, half a gold piece per ounce. Velan haggled. They settled on a third of a gold piece, 8 silver coins per ounce. Daniel sold him 10 ounces, 80 silver coins. Velan counted out the money from his leather purse and loaded the herbs into his cart. Before leaving, he turned around and said one thing, that if the boy knew how to grow silver star on the plains, he should try mountain lavender. It's twice as expensive. Then he left. Daniel stood in the barn, holding 80 silver coins in his hands, heavy, dull, smelling of metal and sweat. His first real money. Not grain, not barter, money. He counted them, divided them up. 20 coins for tools, 20 for fabric and clothes for the family, 20 set aside. He gave 20 to Yuna. She took them and counted them. She asked what they were for. He said it was for her work. Yuna said she hadn't worked. Daniel said that without her, he wouldn't have managed the drainage, and that without her calculations, he wouldn't have known how much to ask Velan for. Yuna held the 20 silver coins in the palm of her hand and looked at them. Then she said quietly that she'd never held that much money before, that she could buy 3 months' worth of flour with it, that her brothers would be able to eat every day. Daniel nodded. He said this was just the beginning. Yuna looked up at him. There was something new in her eyes. Not gratitude, not admiration. Something more complex. She quickly turned away and left. Daniel watched her go. The 5th month brought the first real crisis, not from the Baron, from nature. The temperature dropped 3 weeks earlier than usual. Frosts at the end of summer. Daniel woke up from the cold and stepped outside. The grass was white with frost. The air bit into his lungs. He ran to the open field. The 6th generation wheat stood in ears, ready for harvest in 2 days. The frost had struck the tops. The leaves curled up. The stalks went limp. He stood in front of the field and assessed the damage. Half the crop was lost, 30 kilograms of grain, a month's work. He rushed into the barn. It was warmer there, but not warm enough. The tomatoes had turned brown around the edges. The silver star had wilted. Only the wheat behind the false wall was holding up. The enclosed space retained the heat from the compost piles, which, as they decomposed, gave off an extra 5 or 6 degrees. But that wasn't enough. He needed a stove, a real one, inside the barn. And he knew who could build it. Hannah Osgood, the blacksmith of Meadowbrook. The only female blacksmith for 500 miles around. He'd seen her smithy at the far end of the village. He'd heard the clang of the hammer in the mornings, but he'd never gone inside. There'd been no reason to. Now there was a reason. Daniel arrived at the blacksmith's shop at noon. A low stone building. Smoke was rising from the chimney. He could feel the heat from 10 paces away. He went inside. Hannah was standing at the anvil, broad-shouldered. Her hands were covered in calluses and burns. Her red hair was tied back in a bun. Her face was flushed from the heat. She was forging a horseshoe. Strike, 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 a turn, a blow. The rhythm was as precise as a metronome. Daniel stood at the entrance and waited. Hannah finished the horseshoe. She tossed it into a bucket of water. A hiss, steam. She turned to him. She asked what he needed. Her voice was low, rough, no unnecessary words. Daniel said he needed a stove, a small one, made of clay and stone, with a chimney for the barn. Hannah asked why he needed a stove in the barn. He said he wanted to dry herbs in the winter. Hannah looked at him for a long time. Then she said that a stove for drying herbs was nonsense, that it was easier to dry them in the attic. Daniel said he needed it specifically in the barn. Hannah shrugged. She asked how he would pay. Daniel took out 5 silver coins. Hannah looked at the money, then at him. She took 3. She said 5 was too much, that she wasn't a thief. Daniel hid the remaining 2. Hannah came the next day, with a wheelbarrow. Clay, stones, pieces of iron. She looked around the barn, the front part, abandoned and dusty. She asked where to put them. Daniel pointed to a corner. Hannah worked for 2 days, silently, intently. The stove turned out small, neat, with a chimney leading through the wall. Good draft. Daniel stoked it the first evening. The barn warmed up in an hour. The tomato plants straightened up. The silver star came to life. The temperature inside stayed around 15 degrees, even when it was near 0 outside. He stood in the warm barn amid the greenery and smelled the scent of living earth. The wind whistled outside the wall, but here it was warm, quiet, alive. 3 days later, Hannah returned, without warning. She said she'd forgotten to check the chimney. Daniel led her inside, into the front room. She checked the draft, tapped on the stove's walls. Everything was fine. Then she turned and looked at the false wall, at the boards, at the clay in the cracks, and said that the wall was new. Daniel didn't answer. Hannah stepped closer. She ran her hand along the boards. She found a crack. She peered inside. Daniel stood there waiting. Hannah stepped back. She turned to face him. Her expression was inscrutable. Then she said she didn't care what he was hiding in there, that it was his barn and his business. But if he needed another oven on the other side of the wall, she'd build it for 2 coins. Daniel exhaled. He said he did need one. Hannah nodded and left. She returned a day later with a new batch of clay. Daniel opened the back door for her. Hannah stepped inside and froze. She looked at the tomato plants, at the silver star, at the rows of wheat in wooden crates, at the onions and mustard. She was silent for a minute. Then she turned to Daniel and said that she now understood why he needed a kiln in the barn, and that if she were in his place, she would have built a wall too. She built a second oven, in 2 days. This one was bigger than the first. It had a system of clay pipes that distributed heat across the floor. Daniel hadn't asked her to do this. Hannah did it on her own. She said that plants need heat from below, not from above. Daniel looked at her in surprise. She was right. Heating the root zone is more effective than heating the air. Any greenhouse grower knew that. But Hannah wasn't a greenhouse grower. She was a blacksmith. She simply understood how heat works. He paid her 5 coins instead of 2. She tried to give him 3 back. He refused. He said the pipe system cost more. Hannah smiled. It was the first time she'd done that in front of him. Then she left. At the threshold, she turned around and said that if he needed tools, she could make them, any kind, from a blueprint. Daniel remembered that. While Hannah was building the stoves, a second event took place. Lily found a note. Daniel was in the barn when she ran in, out of breath, her eyes wide. She was holding a dirty scrap of paper. She said she'd been looking for her rag doll under the floorboards and found this instead. Daniel took the paper. He unfolded it. It was in uneven, childish handwriting. The letters were crooked. Some were written backward. He read it. It said that he comes at night and that he isn't who he seems to be. Daniel read it twice, 3 times. Then he looked at Lily. He asked where exactly she had found it. Lily pointed. Under the 3rd floorboard from the door, between the floorboards, tucked deep inside, so that no one would find it. Aiden had written this. The real Aiden Rowe. The boy whose body he had taken over. He'd written it before he drowned in the pond. Daniel knew that Aiden had drowned a week before he woke up. An accident, that's what Hannah said. He went to the pond in the evening, didn't come back. They found him in the morning, on the shore. He'd swallowed a lot of water. He was unconscious for 3 days. Then he woke up, a different person. But the note said otherwise. He comes at night. He's not who he seems to be. Aiden was afraid of someone. He saw someone. He knew something. And maybe his drowning wasn't an accident after all. Daniel hid the note. He told Lily it was just scribbles, that Aiden was probably just playing and making up stories. Lily believed him. She was just a kid. But Daniel didn't believe himself. That evening he sat in the barn and thought, who came at night? Someone who wasn't who they seemed to be. Someone from the village. Someone Daniel had already spoken to. Someone he'd smiled at. Someone from whom he'd bought milk or traded grain. 23 houses in the village. He knew almost everyone. Bran, Mary, Una, Glenn, Hannah, dozens of faces. Which one of them? And what did that 18-year-old boy see that led to him being drowned? Daniel carefully questioned Hannah, not directly, indirectly. He asked if Aiden had gone anywhere in the evenings before he drowned. Hannah thought for a moment. She said that in the last few weeks before the pond incident, Aiden had been strange, not like he used to be. Quiet, skittish. He'd flinch at the sound of a door knocking. Once, she woke up in the middle of the night and saw him sitting by the window. He was staring into the darkness. She asked what was wrong. He said nothing was wrong, but his hands were shaking. Then, 2 days later, the pond. The 6th month, autumn had truly set in at Meadowbrook. The leaves had fallen from the trees over the course of a week. The wind from the north carried the scent of winter. Daniel stood in front of the barn, looking out at his open field. The harvest was in. The wheat had been threshed and bagged. 4 bags, 240 kilograms. 120 of them had gone toward paying off a debt last month. The remaining 120 were his to keep. He owed nothing to anyone. Plus the supplies in the barn, a silver star, tomatoes, onions, mustard, plus 80 silver coins from Valen, of which 40 remained, plus 6th-generation wheat seeds, his main asset. He was richer than most of the peasants in the village, not by much, but enough to get through the winter without going hungry. For the first time in Aiden Rowe's life, winter didn't mean a slow death. But Daniel wasn't going to just survive the winter. He was going to make the most of it. Winter in Meadowbrook lasted 4 months. Snow fell in late October and melted in March. The open fields lay dormant. The farmers stayed indoors. They repaired their tools. They mended their clothes. They rationed their food. They waited for spring. For Daniel, winter meant something else. 4 months in the barn, away from prying eyes. 4 months of accelerated selection. 4 months of preparation for what he had planned for spring. Una came every day. In the morning, just like a job. She kept track of everything on clay tablets. How many seeds, how many silver star leaves, how many tomatoes, how much was spent on firewood for the stoves, how much grain was traded away. She counted everything, and she counted accurately. Once, Daniel made a mistake in his calculations. He rounded up. Una corrected him, silently. She simply wrote the correct number over his. He looked at the tablet and laughed. Una didn't understand why he was laughing. He said that in his life he'd met accountants who were worse at counting. Una asked what an accountant was. He hesitated. He said it was a person who counts money for important people. Una thought for a moment and said she wanted to be an accountant. Daniel looked at her. Then he quietly asked what she herself wanted, really wanted. Una was silent for a long time. A minute, 2. Then she said she wanted to learn how to count for real, like in the capital, not with sticks on clay, but with numbers on paper. Daniel nodded. He remembered. A week later, he set out on his first journey beyond the village. Not to the capital, to the county town of Greenford, a 3-day walk. He couldn't ride a horse. He didn't have one. He couldn't hire a wagon. It would be too conspicuous. So he walked, with a sack slung over his shoulders. In the sack were 20 ounces of dried silver stars, 10 pounds of mustard seeds, and 3 dozen tomatoes wrapped in straw. Hannah didn't want to let him go. She said there were bandits on the roads, that it was madness for a young man to go alone. Daniel said he had to go, that he'd be back in a week. Hannah started crying. Lily hugged his leg and wouldn't let go. He crouched down and told her he'd be back, that he'd definitely be back, and that he'd bring her a present. Lily asked what kind. He said it would be a surprise. 3 days to Greenford. The road was empty. A couple of carts passed by, once a caravan of merchants. Daniel walked quickly. He slept by the roadside, wrapped in a blanket. He ate crackers and peas. On the third day, he saw Greenford. The town stood on a hill at the confluence of two rivers, stone walls, towers, gates. Inside, two-story houses, cobblestone streets, a market, a temple, barracks. By Meadowbrook standards, it was a metropolis. By Daniel's standards, it was a small medieval town with a population of 5,000. He entered through the gates. The guards looked at him indifferently. A peasant boy with a sack, nothing out of the ordinary. The market was open until noon. Daniel walked along the rows, meat, bread, fabrics, pots, tools, and in the far corner, a row of spices and herbs. 3 stalls. He went around all 3. The first was run by a fat man with a red face. The merchandise was mediocre. The prices were high. The second was run by an old woman with a wart on her nose. The herbs were dry and dusty, clearly from last year. The third stall was different, clean, neat. On the counter were jars of ground spices, little bags of herbs, candles, oils. Behind the counter stood a woman, about 26 years old, dark hair, sharp features, a red dress, the only bright spot in the gray market. Clara Windsor. Daniel didn't know her name yet. He walked up to the counter and placed a handful of silver stars on it. Clara looked at the herbs, then at him, then back at the herbs. She took the bundle, crumpled a leaf between her fingers, sniffed it. Her eyes widened for a split second. Then her face became inscrutable. She asked where he was from. Daniel said from the north, from the village. Clara asked how much he had. He opened the bag, showed her 20 ounces. Clara looked into the bag. Then she locked the shop. She turned the sign on the door. Closed. She led him into the back room. It was small, a table, 2 chairs, shelves with merchandise. She sat down. He sat across from her. Clara said that a silver star of this quality was worth a gold piece per ounce in the capital, that in Greenford she could sell it for 3/4 of a gold piece, that she was offering him half a gold piece per ounce, 10 gold pieces for 20 ounces. Daniel shook his head. He said that Velen pays 1/3, that he wants 2/3. Clara laughed. She said he was bold for a country bumpkin. They haggled for half an hour. They settled on 7 silver pieces per ounce, a little less than what Velen offered. But Clara offered something more important than money, a steady supply. She would take everything he brought, regularly, every month, and she distributed it across 3 provinces through her trading network. Daniel asked what kind of network she had. Clara said she had 3 locations: Greenford, the port city of Windhall, and the town of Cranmore in the south. Her husband had built that network before he drowned at sea 2 years ago. She said this matter-of-factly, without tremor in her voice, just as one might talk about the weather. Daniel recognized that tone, the tone of someone who had come to terms with the past and locked that door behind them. They shook hands. Daniel sold her a silver star, mustard seeds, and tomatoes. When Clara saw the tomatoes, she fell silent. She picked one up. She turned it over in her hands. She sniffed it. She took a bite. She chewed slowly. Then she put the tomato on the table and stared at the wall for 3 seconds. Then she turned to Daniel and asked what it was. He said it was a tomato. Clara said she'd never tasted anything like it, that it had an impossible flavor, that she'd sell it in Windhall for the price of spices. Daniel said he didn't have many yet, 3 dozen. Just to test the waters. If it goes well, there'll be more by spring. Clara nodded. Then she said quietly that he was strange for a peasant, that peasants don't haggle like that, don't look like that, don't talk like that. Daniel shrugged. He said that hunger teaches you quickly. Clara smirked. She didn't believe him, but she accepted it. The total came to 12 gold and 4 silver. Daniel had never held that much money in Aiden Rowe's hands before. He hid the coins in the belt that Hannah had sewn, under his shirt, close to his body. Before leaving Greenford, he did 2 things. First, he went to the market and bought a slate and chalk for Una. Abacus charts from the capital would have been better, but they didn't sell them here. The slate and chalk would do for now. Second, he went into the bookstore, a room attached to the temple. Dusty scrolls, worn-out notebooks, a few leather-bound books. The books were expensive, 1 gold coin per volume. He bought one, an old herbarium with drawings of plants. Half the names were unfamiliar to him, but the drawings were precise. He could identify the family, genus, sometimes the species. It was his first scientific book in this world. The return trip took 3 days. He walked and leafed through the herbarium during his stops. He found the mountain lavender that Velen had mentioned. He found a plant similar to Earth's ginseng. He found something that looked like wild pepper. Each of these plants was worth more than a silver star. Each could be grown in the barn. Winter came hard to Meadowbrook. Snow fell in late October and didn't melt. Temperatures dropped to -15. The north wind howled through the cracks in the houses. The trees stood black and bare. The village froze solid. But Daniel's barn was alive. 2 stoves burned around the clock. He had stocked up on firewood in advance, 3 cartloads from the forest, which he had chopped himself. June's brothers helped haul it in. The temperature inside remained steady, 14 to 16 degrees. The tomatoes were bearing fruit. The silver star was in bloom. The 8th-generation wheat stood in ears. And in the far corner, behind the wooden shelves, Daniel had begun his most ambitious project, hydroponics. Not the real thing, not the kind he'd built for farmers in California with plastic pipes and electric pumps. A primitive one, made of clay pots and wooden troughs. The principle was simple. The plants grew not in soil, but in a mixture of gravel and compost. Water containing dissolved nutrients was fed through a sloped trough, by gravity, without a pump. He poured water into the top pot. It flowed down the trough through the plant's roots. It collected in the lower bucket. He lifted the bucket and poured it back in from the top. A closed cycle, manual, labor-intensive, but it worked. Herbs were the first to be grown hydroponically. Silver star, wild mint, lemongrass, which he found on the bank of a stream in the fall. The results exceeded expectations. The roots grew faster in water than in soil. With the growth accelerator, the difference was enormous. A silver star bush in hydroponics produced as many leaves in 5 days as it did in a pot in 10. Productivity doubled. But the system required constant attention. The water had to be changed every 2 days. The nutrient solution had to be prepared from ash and bone meal. The temperature had to be monitored. Daniel couldn't do it all by himself. Una took charge of record-keeping and watering on schedule. She came twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. She poured in water, checked the level, and recorded it on the board. They worked side by side for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking. Una asked questions, lots of questions. Why did the water have to be warm? Why does ash help them grow? Why do some plants like light and others like shade? Daniel explained, in simple words, without scientific terms, just as he'd explained to the farmers in Kenya. Una listened and nodded. Then she repeated it in her own words. Exactly. Without any mistakes. Once she asked where he knew all this from. Daniel paused. Then he said he'd dreamed it. Una looked at him with that same direct, unblinking gaze. Then she said that she usually dreamed about goats, not about how to grow plants in water. Daniel didn't know what to say. Una smiled. It was the first time he'd seen that smile on her face. Light, warm, almost playful. Then she went back to work and didn't ask any more questions. Winter dragged on. Daniel made the most of every day. The wheat breeding program had reached the 10th generation. The grains were as big as peas, golden, heavy, resistant to northern blight, resistant to frost. The yield was 3 times higher than standard. It was a breakthrough. In his old world, such a result would have taken 20 years of work by an entire laboratory. Here, he'd done it in 6 months, alone, in the barn, with goat manure and clay pots. He sat there in the evening, sorting through the seeds. Each grain passed through his fingers. He selected the best ones, set them aside, labeled them, jotted them down in a notebook he'd sewn together from scraps of fabric. That notebook was his most precious possession, more important than money, more important than a silver star. It contained all his records, generations, crossbreeding, results, figures, and diagrams. If anyone ever read that notebook, they would see the history of the world's first scientific plant breeding program. But no one was supposed to read it, yet. By midwinter, Daniel had begun his second major project, buying out the Han family's plot of land. Yuna's family was on the brink. Her mother was ill. Her 2 younger brothers weren't yet able to work at full capacity. The plot had been mortgaged to Baron Crane. The debt amounted to 60 kilograms of grain. If they didn't pay by spring, the Baron would take the land. Daniel offered Yuna a deal. He would pay off her family's debt. The plot wouldn't go to him, but would remain with the hens. But they would work together, a partnership. Yuna would manage the joint farm. She keeps the books. She allocates resources. She receives a share of the profits. Yuna listened in silence. Then she asked why he wouldn't just take the plot for himself. That would be easier, cheaper, more logical. Daniel said he wasn't a baron, that he didn't need serfs, that he needed partners, people who work because it's their land, not because they have no choice. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly that he was saying things she'd never heard before, that things don't work that way in this world, that the land belongs to whoever pays for it, not to whoever works it. Daniel replied that he wanted it to be that way. Yuna nodded. She took his hand. She shook it, firmly, briefly. Then she let go and turned away. He could see her shoulders trembling, but she wasn't crying. She didn't know how to cry. She'd forgotten how when she was 12, when she started supporting the family in her father's place. By the end of winter, Daniel had paid off the Han family's debt. He delivered 60 kilograms of grain to Crane's estate. The steward accepted it. He issued a receipt. He looked at Daniel with the same expression he'd had the first time: surprise, suspicion, and greed. The grain was excellent, 10th generation. The steward rubbed the grains between his fingers. He sniffed them. He shook his head. He said he hadn't seen such quality in a long time. He asked if Roe would like to sell the seeds to the Baron. Daniel said no. The steward shrugged. But Daniel saw him slip a handful of grains into his pocket, a sample for the Baron. Crane will find out. Crane will want some. Crane will come. On the way back, Daniel stopped on a hill from which he could see Meadowbrook. The village lay in the snow, gray, quiet. Spring arrived at the end of March. The snow melted away in 2 weeks. The black, damp earth was laid bare. Daniel walked out to the field and crouched down. He scooped up a handful of soil. He rubbed it between his fingers. He sniffed it. He smiled. The soil had changed. 8 months of work. Clover, peas, compost, ash, manure, mulch, drainage. The earth that had been dead, gray dust had come to life. Dark, loose, teeming with worms. Not just in the designated beds, everywhere. The organic matter from the compost piles and clover roots had spread beyond the accelerated zones, slowly, naturally, but irreversibly. Roe's plot was now more fertile than any in the village, and it showed. Bran arrived first. He stood by the fence. He looked at the ground, then at his own plot, then back again. He shook his head. He said that Roe was lucky with his spot, that there was probably a spring bubbling up under his house. Daniel nodded. A spring. Let it be a spring. Better than the truth. Spring meant the beginning of a new phase. Daniel gathered his people, Bran, Una, Mary, and Hannah, not in the barn, but at his own home. Hannah gave them herbal tea. Lily sat in the corner, drawing on a board. Daniel laid out a plan on the table, not on paper. Paper was too expensive, but on a wooden board that Hannah had planed specifically for this purpose. He sketched a map of Meadowbrook, 23 houses, plots of land, roads, a stream, the forest, and the empty fields around them that belonged to the Baron. Daniel said he wanted to buy out 2 more plots, those of the Grayson family and the Turner family. Both were on the brink of ruin. Both were in debt to the Baron. Buy out their debts, keep the families on their land. A partnership, the same terms as the Hens. Bran asked why he needed 4 plots. Daniel said he needed the space, that he wanted to plant all 4 plots with a new variety of wheat, his own, a 10th generation strain, that the harvest would be 3 times higher than usual, that it would be enough to feed all 4 families and sell the surplus in Greenford. Bran whistled. He said Crane wouldn't allow it. Daniel replied that Crane would have no choice. If the debts were paid off, the plots would be legally free. The Baron couldn't take them away. He could only buy them, and no one would sell. Una added the figures. She'd calculated everything in advance, the cost of paying off the debts, the cost of the seeds, the expected harvest, and the income from sales in Greenford through Clara. She spoke, and precisely, without hesitation, without mistakes. Bran listened, and his eyes grew wider and wider. Mary was silent. So was Hannah. When Una finished, Bran said that the girl was better at math than the town clerk. Una didn't react, but Daniel noticed the corners of her lips lift slightly. Mary asked only one thing. She asked what would happen if the Baron got angry. Daniel said the Baron would get angry. It was inevitable. But the Baron was alone, and there were already 5 of them, plus their families, plus Clara in Greenford, plus Velen on the road. 20 people against one fat little nobleman. Hannah snorted and said that if necessary, she'd forge a pitchfork for him. Everyone laughed, except Una. She stared at the map and thought something in her head. A week later, Daniel bought out the Graysons and Turners' debts. 80 kilograms of grain for both of them. Crane's steward accepted the grain in silence, this time without asking any questions. But Daniel saw his face, stony, impassive. The steward understood what was happening. A peasant boy is buying up debts, gathering land, building something. 3 days later, Baron Crane himself arrived, for the first time in 2 years, in a carriage, with 2 servants. A fat man in his 50s, a red face, small eyes swollen with fat, fingers adorned with rings, a silver chain with a coat of arms around his neck. He stopped at the row house. He climbed out of the carriage with difficulty, panting. He looked out over the property, at the green earth, at the neat rows of early wheat, at the repaired barn, at the new fence Daniel had put up a week ago. Crane stood and watched, for a long time. Then he turned to Daniel, who had stepped out onto the porch. He said he'd heard that young Roe had become a successful farmer, that it was commendable, that in such difficult times it was a pleasure to see a hard-working farmer. His voice was smooth, soft, dangerous. Daniel bowed, briefly, politely. He said he was doing his best, that he was grateful to the Baron for his patience regarding the debt. Crane waved his hand. He said the debt was a trifle, that he was interested in something else. Where had Roe gotten such seeds, such grain, such land? Daniel repeated the story about the wandering merchant. Crane nodded. He listened. He didn't believe it. Then he asked if Roe would like to enter the Baron's service as head gardener, a good salary, a house on the estate, protection. Daniel said he was grateful for the honor, but that he was attached to his land. Crane smiled, a broad, oily smile. He said he'd think it over and that he hoped Roe would do the same. Then he got into his carriage and drove off. Daniel stood there, watching the dust from the wheels. An offer of service, polite, subtle. This was the first stage. Next would come pressure, then threats, then action. He knew this scenario. He'd seen it dozens of times in countries where petty officials and landowners took everything farmers had. First, an offer you can't refuse. Then, when you refuse, the trouble begins. He needed protection, not from the Baron directly, from what stood above the Baron, the law, a patron, someone with a title and authority who could shield him from Crane. Clara had told him about such a person, Viscount Ashton, a liberal, an old man with progressive views. He hates Crane. He lives on an estate 2 days' journey south of Greenford. Daniel remembered that name, Viscount Ashton, but he had to get to the Viscount first. In the meantime, Daniel set about the spring sowing. 4 plots: Roe, Han, Grayson, Turner. He handed out the 10th generation seeds. He showed each family how to prepare the soil. Ash, manure, compost, crop rotation, clover between the rows, mulch on the unseeded plots. Everyone worked. The men dug, the women sowed, the children carried water. Bran walked between the plots and made sure everything was done as Daniel had said. He grumbled, he crossed himself, but he kept an eye on things. Una kept the overall records: 4 plots, seed usage, compost usage, area, expected yield. She drew up a chart on a wooden board, neat, even, with columns and rows. Daniel looked at this chart and thought that Una had invented the spreadsheet 6 centuries before the computer. He caught himself thinking that he was looking at her too often, at the way she furrowed her brow when she was calculating, at the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she leaned over the board, at the way her hands moved precisely and confidently as she wrote the numbers. She was 19. Inside, he was 34. Aiden's body was that of an 18-year-old, and his body reacted to her closeness just as an 18-year-old's body would. A racing heartbeat, warmth in his chest, awkwardness when she stood too close. Daniel suppressed it. Not the time, not the place, too much at stake. But it was getting harder and harder to hold back. By the end of the first month of spring, the wheat on all 4 plots had sprouted in even rows, green, strong, healthy, without growth accelerators. On ordinary soil, but with the right seeds and proper farming techniques. The 3 neighboring plots belonging to other families looked the same as always, gray, stunted, diseased. The contrast was striking. People noticed. They started coming by, asking questions, begging for seeds. Daniel gave them some, not for free, in exchange for a share of the harvest, for work, for a commitment to follow his instructions on planting and care. By mid-spring, 8 families were working under his terms, 8 plots, 30 people, a small agricultural cooperative in a world where such a word didn't exist. He didn't call himself a leader. He didn't give orders. He didn't act like a boss. He simply knew what to do, and people followed him because for the first time in 3 years of famine, someone knew what to do. By the end of spring, the first ears of wheat began to fill out, golden, heavy, even. Daniel stood at the edge of the field and watched. 8 plots of wheat in a village where there had been consecutive years of crop failure. 8 families who would be well-fed this fall. Not rich, just well-fed. That was the beginning. The summer of the second year began with a harvest. All 8 plots yielded grain at the same time. Daniel stood on a hill and looked down, golden stripes amid the gray fields. His fields, his people, his wheat. The 10th generation, resistant to rot, 3 times more productive than the standard variety. 8 families went out to harvest together, The men reaped with sickles, the women bound the sheaves, the children gathered the ears of wheat. Bran commanded like a general. In a hoarse voice, he gave instructions on who should carry what and where to stack it. Una walked around with a board, counting the sheaves. By the evening of the first day, Daniel had calculated the preliminary harvest, 800 kilograms from 8 plots, 3 times more than the village had harvested in its best year before the blight. That was enough to feed all 8 families until the following summer, and another 300 kilograms to sell. He set aside 100 kilograms of the best grain for seed. He took 200 to Greenford. Clara accepted the grain without haggling. She paid the market price, 6 gold coins, plus 30 ounces of silver stars from the granary at 7 silver coins per ounce, another 21 gold coins, plus the tomatoes. The tomatoes were a hit. Clara sold them in Windhall as an exotic fruit. Wealthy merchants paid 1 silver coin apiece, 5 gold coins per batch. Total revenue for the summer came to 32 gold coins. Daniel divided the money, 1/3 for himself, 1/3 to the partners, proportional to their contributions, 1/3 to the common fund for tools and seeds. Una kept track of every coin. She wrote it down on the board. Then she transferred it to a notebook that Daniel had sewn for her out of fabric. An expense notebook, an income notebook, a seed notebook. 3 notebooks. The accounting system of a medieval cooperative. The money changed the village's dynamics. The families who hadn't joined the partnership in the spring were now standing in line. Daniel accepted 4 more. That made 12 families out of 23, half the village. But the money didn't just attract allies. 2 weeks after the harvest, Reed came to see Daniel, a tax collector. This time, he wasn't alone. With him was a man in a black cloak, short, thin, shaven head, eyes like 2 nails. Reed introduced him as Brother Marcus of the Order of the Wheat Ear. Daniel felt a chill in his stomach. The Order of the Wheat Ear, a religious organization. Officially, it blesses the harvest, consecrates the grain, prays for fertility. Unofficially, it controls the kingdom's food supply through a network of monastic granaries. Daniel knew about them from Clara. She had said that the order held real power over bread, that they decided who to sell grain to and who not to, that their leader, Archbishop Valens, sat at the king's right hand, and that they didn't like it when anyone grew grain outside their system. Brother Marcus walked through Daniel's plot, slowly, carefully. He crouched down by a row, plucked an ear of wheat, crushed it between his fingers. He sniffed it. He bit into a grain. Then he stood up and looked at Daniel. He asked where he'd gotten these seeds. Daniel told him about the traveling merchant. Marcus didn't bat an eye. He said the order was interested in new varieties, that it was their sacred duty to oversee the kingdom's grain, that he'd like to take some samples for a blessing. Daniel couldn't refuse. To refuse the order meant inviting a charge of heresy. He handed over a handful of grain. Marcus carefully poured it into a canvas pouch. He hid it in the folds of his cloak. Then he looked at Daniel once more. With that same look, the nails dug in deeper, and he rode off with Reed. Daniel stood there, feeling cold sweat run down his back. The order. This was worse than Crane. Crane was a petty, greedy little nobleman. The order was a system, ancient, powerful, with people everywhere, with money, with power. And now they knew about him. That evening, he called a council meeting. Bran, Una, Mary, Hannah. He told them about the visit. Bran turned pale. He said that the order was bad, that they took grain from the villages for next to nothing and sold it in the capital for 3 times the price, that whoever stood in their way simply disappeared. Mary crossed herself. Hannah spat and said that the monks had greasier hands than the Baron. Una was silent. Then she asked what to do. Daniel said they needed a patron, someone with a title and influence, someone who could protect them from both the Order and Crane at the same time. Viscount Ashton. Una asked how he planned to get in touch with the Viscount. Daniel said through Clara. Clara trades in 3 provinces. She has connections. She can arrange a meeting. A week later, Daniel was back in Greenford. Clara listened to him in the back room of her shop. She poured wine into 2 earthenware mugs. She downed hers in 1 gulp. She said that Viscount Ashton was a stubborn old man, that he hates Crane and the Order in equal measure, that he considers the grain loan system to be slavery and speaks out about it publicly, for which he is hated at court. She said she could write him a letter, but that the Viscount doesn't meet with peasants, that he needs a reason. Daniel took 3 tomatoes and a bunch of silver stars out of his bag. He placed them on the table. He said that was his reason. A product that no one else in the kingdom has. A technology that could transform agriculture across an entire province. And a man who knows how it works. Clara looked at the tomatoes, then at him. Then she finished her 2nd cup of wine. She said he was crazy, that a peasant couldn't just walk up to a viscount and offer him an agricultural revolution. Daniel said he wasn't offering a revolution. He was offering profit. Clara fell silent. Then she laughed. She said all right, that she'd write to the viscount, and that if he were executed for his audacity, she'd keep his tomato seeds for herself. They sat there for another hour, drinking wine. Clara told him about her husband, how he built a trading network, how he set sail, how he once brought her a red dress from across the ocean, how she stood on the shore and waited, how she stopped waiting. She spoke calmly, without tears, but her fingers gripped the mugs so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Daniel listened and didn't interrupt. When she fell silent, he said that her husband had built a good network, that she had kept it going, that it takes more strength to maintain it than to build it. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she quietly told him to go already, that she needed to close the shop. Daniel stood up. At the door, he turned around. He noticed a pot with a withered flower on her windowsill. He asked if she wanted him to bring her a seedling, a living one. Clara looked at the pot, then at him. She said that if he brought her a living flower in the winter, she would truly believe in his tomatoes. Daniel nodded and walked off into the night. A reply from Viscount Ashton arrived a month later. Clara had sent a messenger with a short note. The Viscount invited the farmer Rowe to his estate, Ashton Hall, in 2 weeks with samples. Daniel prepared for this meeting as if he were defending his dissertation. He gathered the best samples of grain and a selection of tomatoes, fresh and dried silver star, mustard seeds, a bunch of wild ginger that he'd started growing in the barn 2 months ago. Una helped pack everything, silently, intently. When everything was ready, she looked up at him and told him not to bow too low. Whether he was a viscount or not, Daniel was worth just as much. Daniel looked at her. She was standing in the barn doorway. The setting sun was shining on her back. Her hair had slipped out from under her headscarf. Her hands were covered in dirt. Her apron was stained. And in her eyes was what he'd been afraid to see. Not admiration, not gratitude, something more. He turned away. He said he'd be back in a week. Ashton Hall stood 2 days' journey south of Greenford, a stone mansion on a hill, a park, stables, a vineyard on the southern slope. An old, quiet wealth, not ostentatious like Crane's, but genuine. Viscount Ashton received him in the library, a tall, thin old man of about 60, gray hair down to his shoulders, clear blue eyes, hands that were thin but strong. He sat in an armchair by the fireplace and watched as Daniel laid out the samples on the table. He said nothing. When Daniel finished, the Viscount stood up. He walked over to the table. He picked up an ear of wheat, examined it. He picked up a tomato, sniffed it. He took a bite, chewed slowly, put it back. Then he turned to Daniel and said that Clara hadn't lied, that this was truly unusual. He asked how. Daniel explained, not everything, not about the accelerator, about breeding, about selection, about generations, about how he crossbreeds varieties and selects the best ones, about compost, about crop rotation, about hydroponics. The Viscount listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question. He asked where Daniel had learned all this. Daniel said from a wandering scientist, that the man had lived with them for a year and taught him in exchange for food and a roof over his head. The Viscount smiled subtly. He said it was the most beautiful lie he'd heard in a long time, and that he didn't care. He was interested in the result. They talked for 3 hours. The Viscount turned out to be exactly as Clara had described him, a liberal, a reformer, a man who believed the kingdom could be changed. He hated the grain loan system. He hated the order of the wheat ear. He hated that the peasants lived like cattle. And yet he was smart enough to understand that hatred alone wasn't enough. He needed tools. He needed evidence. He needed numbers. Daniel gave him the numbers: crop yields, income, number of families, and annual growth. The Viscount listened and nodded. Then he leaned back in his chair and said he was taking Daniel under his protection, officially, with a document and a seal. That Baron Crane wouldn't dare lay a finger on Viscount Ashton's man, that the Order would think twice as well. But in return, he wanted one thing: for Daniel to demonstrate the same results on his lands, to plant a plot at Ashton Hall, to prove that it worked not only in Meadowbrook. Daniel agreed. They shook hands. Before leaving, the Viscount stopped him. He said his daughter would like to speak with him about agriculture. Daniel was surprised. The Viscount smiled wryly. He said that his daughter had been banished from the capital for publicly calling a royal advisor ignorant on matters of agricultural policy, that she was bored at the estate and was looking for someone to talk to. Lady Sun-A Park entered the library like a gust of wind. She was petite. Her black hair was pulled back into a neat bun. Her dress was simple, gray, with no jewelry. Her eyes were dark and quick. She sat down across from Daniel and immediately began asking questions, not about tomatoes, about the system, how he'd organized the cooperative, what terms he offered, how he divided the profits, how he resolved disputes, how he motivated people. Daniel answered, and with each answer, he saw her eyes light up brighter. She understood, not like Una, who understood numbers, not like Clara, who understood money. Sun-A understood the system, scale, potential. She didn't see a village of 12 families. She saw a model that could be scaled up to a province, to a kingdom. An hour later, she said she wanted to come to Meadowbrook to see it with her own eyes. Daniel said he'd be happy to have her. Sun-A smiled, subtly, ironically. She said she was warning him right away. She didn't know how to keep quiet. She didn't know how to pretend. And if she saw nonsense, she'd say it was nonsense. Daniel replied that that was exactly what he needed. Sun-A tilted her head. She looked at him appraisingly. Then she said he was the first man who hadn't asked her to be quieter. Daniel replied that he needed criticism, not silence. Sun-A stood up. She held out her hand. They shook hands. Her palm was small, but her grip was firm. Daniel returned to Meadowbrook 5 days later with a document from the Viscount, a seal, a signature, and a letter of patronage. He showed the document to Una. She read it, slowly, syllable by syllable. Reading was harder for her than numbers, but she read it. Then she looked up at him and said that this changed everything. Daniel nodded. It did change everything. Now Crane couldn't take their land without the Viscount's permission. The Order couldn't accuse him of heresy without the patron's consent. They had protection, their first real protection, not made of straw and clay, made of law and authority. A month later, Sun-A arrived, on horseback, alone, without servants, wearing men's pants and boots. Hannah nearly fell over when she saw the Viscount's daughter sitting astride a horse by their fence. Sune dismounted. She looked around. She looked at the farm, at the barn, at the dilapidated houses all around. Then she turned to Daniel and said that now she understood why he wanted so badly to change things. She stayed at Meadowbrook for a week. She walked through the fields. She talked to the families. She took notes in a notebook she'd brought from the capital, a real paper notebook with a leather cover. Yuna regarded this notebook as if it were a sacred object. Sune noticed. On the evening of the third day, she took a second notebook out of her bag, a blank one, and handed it to Yuna. She said she needed someone to keep records on site and that this notebook was for taking notes. Yuna took the notebook with both hands, opened it, and ran her finger across the blank page. Then she looked at Sune and said, "Thank you," in a voice she'd never used before. Sune nodded. Then she turned to Daniel and said quietly that she now understood why he needed Yuna, that the girl was worth 5 capital city accountants. Daniel nodded. A week later, Sune left. She took with her the draft of the land reform project they'd written over 3 consecutive nights. The draft was rough, unpolished, but it captured the essence: partnership instead of sharecropping, equity participation instead of debt bondage, seed stations instead of monastery granaries, schools for peasant children, public seed libraries. When Daniel handed her the scroll and asked her to point out where he'd gone wrong, Sune took it and went into her room. Half an hour later, he heard a sound coming from behind the door, quiet, muffled. She was crying. He didn't knock. In the morning, she came out with red eyes and said there were many mistakes, that they would work on it, and that, for the first time in her life, she had been asked to think. The second year was nearing its midpoint. The Silver Star plantation was operating at full capacity. 40 bushes in the barn, 20 in the new greenhouse that Daniel had built behind Mary's house. 60 bushes yielded 50 ounces of dried leaves per month. Through Clara, the product was distributed to 3 provinces, through Valen to a 4th. The income was stable, predictable, enough to sustain the entire cooperative and set aside funds for expansion. But the money attracted attention, and attention came. Not from Crane. Crane had gone quiet after the Viscount's letter arrived. He sat at his estate, nursing his resentment. The attention came from the east, an epidemic. A fever swept through the eastern provinces in the summer, and by fall it had reached the army garrisons. Soldiers were dying by the dozens. There was a shortage of medicine. Pharmacies in the capital had jacked up the prices. The monastery's granaries were hoarding their supplies. And then someone in the army department remembered the shipments of Silver Star from the remote north. The quality was excellent. The price was reasonable. The source was unknown. Military surgeon Noah Gillian arrived in Meadowbrook in early fall, on horseback, escorted by 2 soldiers. A short woman in a leather jacket and pants, short hair, a weather-beaten face. Her hands were slender but had short nails and calluses from the scalpel. She dismounted at the row house and introduced herself. Army Surgeon Noah Gillian, Royal Medical School, Eastern Border Garrison. She had arrived on the quartermaster's orders to inspect the quality and quantity of Silver Star shipments. Daniel looked at her and thought, an inspector, an official one, with authority. This was more serious than Brother Marcus with his handful of grain. Nobody surveyed the open field. She inspected the greenhouse by Mary's house. She plucked a Silver Star leaf. She crushed it. She sniffed it. She tasted it on her tongue. Then she looked at Daniel and said that the concentration of the active ingredient in these leaves was twice as high as the pharmaceutical standard. That this doesn't happen, that a plant grown on the plains couldn't be stronger than one from the mountains. That she needed an explanation. Daniel said that he'd been selecting the best plants from generation to generation, that this was what ensured quality. Noah stared at him without blinking. Then she said that she'd studied botany for 3 years in medical school, and that selective breeding over such a short period couldn't produce these results. that he was either lying or he had something she didn't know about. Daniel was silent. Noah was silent too. Then she said she didn't care either way, that in her infirmary on the eastern border with childbed fever, that 3 of them would die by the end of the week if they didn't get the medicine, that she hadn't come to expose him, she'd come to buy. Daniel sold her the entire stock, 30 ounces of dried silver star, at market price. Noah paid from the army treasury, in gold. She loaded the sacks onto the horses. Before riding off, she turned around. She said she'd be back, that she needed more, and that if he found a way to grow a plant to treat childbed fever, she'd be indebted to him for the lives he'd save. She rode off. Daniel stood there thinking. A plant for childbed fever. In his world, it would have been an antibiotic, penicillin. There was no penicillin here, but there were plants with antibacterial properties. He opened the herbarium he'd bought in Greenford. He flipped through the pages. He found what he was looking for. A plant with a long name that the locals called goldenroot. It grew in the mountains. It was rare. Its roots contained a substance with powerful antibacterial properties. In his world, the closest equivalent was berberine. He had never grown goldenroot before, but he had an accelerator, and he knew the principles. He needed seeds or seedlings. He sent Mei Lin. Mei Lin Cho, the girl he'd found on the road 2 months ago. She'd been sitting by the roadside next to her father's body, a wandering herbalist. He'd died of a heart attack right on the road. Daniel brought the body to the village. He buried him. Mei Lin stayed. She had nowhere else to go. Hannah took her into her home. Lily grabbed her by the hand that very first evening and never let go. Mei Lin was quiet, shy. She spoke little, but she knew plants like no one else in the village did. Her father had taught her. She recognized herbs by their scent, by the shape of their leaves, by the texture of their stems. She walked barefoot and talked to the flowers. Literally. She greeted every bush. She stroked the leaves. She whispered something. At first, Daniel thought it was odd. Then he realized it was a skill. She sensed the plants, not magically, but intuitively. She noticed things he missed: a withered leaf, an incipient disease, a lack of water. He sent her to the mountains to the south, with a detailed description of the golden root from the herbarium, with food for a week, with a note for Clara in case she needed help in Greenford. Mei Lin left at dawn, with a bag slung over her shoulder, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, barefoot. Lily stood at the gate and waved to her until she disappeared behind the hill. Mei Lin returned 10 days later with 5 golden root seedlings, alive, in clay pots wrapped in damp cloth. Daniel planted them in the barn, secured them. 2 weeks later, the roots produced their first shoots. A month later, the bushes were fully grown. A month and a half later, he harvested the first crop of roots. He dried them, ground them into powder. He sent a sample to Noah via military mail. The reply arrived 3 weeks later. A short note. Noah wrote that the powder worked, that 3 out of 4 women with childbed fever had survived, that this was the best result of her entire career, that she was coming to see him with a large order, and that he'd better prepare plenty. Daniel read the note and felt something strange. Not pride, not joy, relief. The women had survived, 3 out of 4. Not all of them, 1 had died, but 3 had survived. In his former world, antibiotics saved everyone. Here, 3 out of 4 was a miracle. He folded the note and tucked it into his notebook. Noah arrived 2 weeks later, this time without soldiers, alone. She walked into the barn. She looked at the golden root, at the silver star, at the tomatoes, at the wheat, at the hydroponic system. She was silent for 5 minutes. Then she turned to Daniel and said that he was doing what medical school had promised her when she was a student, saving people on a large scale. That the school had lied, but he hadn't. She ordered 100 ounces of the golden root for the army in exchange for gold. Daniel said he needed 2 months. Noah said she had 2 months. Then she quietly added that if anyone tried to stop him, the army would protect him, that she personally guaranteed it. Daniel looked at her, a small, rough-around-the-edges woman with the hands of a surgeon, who swore like a soldier and cried over dying women in labor. He nodded. He said he'd take the 2 months. Noah nodded back. She shook his hand, firmly, and left. The end of the 2nd year. Baron Crane struck a blow. Not with robbers, not with spies. With a piece of paper. He filed a complaint with the king, an official one, with a seal. The peasant Aidan Rowe was behaving in a manner unbecoming of his station. He is buying up land. He is trading in violation of guild regulations. He is forming illegal associations. He is undermining order. He is claiming a status higher than his station. A royal investigation is required. The Order of the Wheat Ear supported the complaint. Archbishop Mortimer Valens personally added a note at the bottom stating that the order was concerned about the appearance on the market of grain and herbs of unknown origin, and that this might be the result of forbidden practices. Forbidden practices, a fancy name for an accusation of witchcraft. Daniel learned of this from Sun A. She had sent a messenger from the capital. The letter was brief. The complaint had been filed. The king had scheduled an audience in 2 months. Rowe was required to appear at court to offer an explanation. If he failed to appear, he would be found guilty in absentia. His lands were confiscated. The family arrested. 2 months. Daniel convened the council one last time. Everyone was there. Bran, Una, Mary, Hannah, Mei Lin. Hannah sat in the corner with Lily on her lap. Lily was already 8. She no longer looked like a starving child. Her cheeks were round. Her hair was tied with a red ribbon he'd brought back from Greenford a year ago. She could read, write, count to 1,000. Una had taught her. Daniel spoke about the complaint. Bran turned pale. Mary crossed herself. Hannah cursed so loudly that Hannah covered Lily's ears. Una remained silent. She stared at the table. Then she looked up and asked what he needed for the audience. Daniel said he needed numbers, facts, evidence, how much grain he'd given to the village, how much medicine he'd supplied to the army, how many families he'd pulled out of debt, how much tax he'd paid. Everything on paper, all signed. Una nodded. She said she had it all, in her notebooks. Every coin, every sack, every ounce. She'd been keeping records for a year and a half. Not a single mistake. Not a single omission. Daniel looked at her. Una Han, 19 years old. A peasant girl who had never left her village, who had learned to count using sticks on clay. And now she kept accounts that could stand up to a royal audit. He said thank you. Una turned away. The next 2 months were the most stressful of his life, in both of his lives. He prepared the documents. Sun A helped from the capital. She sent letters with advice, how to speak at court, what words to use, whom to bow to, and whom to avoid. She wrote a speech for him. He rewrote it 3 times. Noah sent a letter of recommendation from the quartermaster of the Eastern Army, an official one, with a military seal. The letter stated that the peasant Rowe had supplied the army with medicines worth 40 gold pieces, and that without these supplies, the losses from the epidemic would have been twice as high. Viscount Ashton wrote his own letter to the king, It contained a detailed description of the results Daniel had achieved on his lands. The plot in Ashton Hall, sown with Daniel's seeds, yielded a harvest 2.5 times higher than the standard. This fact was verified by an independent appraiser. Clara gathered the commercial documentation, invoices, receipts, and testimonials from buyers in 3 provinces. Hannah forged a clasp for his cloak, made of iron, simple, sturdy. She said that everyone needs something reliable when they go into battle. Mary gave him a bunch of dried lavender. She said it was for good luck. Mei Lin brought a small pot with an apple tree sapling. She said it was from the earth, so he'd remember why he was going. Lily drew him a flower on a piece of paper, crooked, with 7 petals, and signed it at the bottom in scrawled letters, "For my brother." Daniel put all the gifts into a bag, the numbers into a scroll, the samples into a separate bag, and he set off. Yuna caught up with him just outside the village. She walked beside him in silence, 1/2 kilometer. Then she stopped. He stopped too. She looked at him. Then she said quietly that he had to come back, that she'd gotten used to him, that without him, the notebooks didn't make sense. Daniel wanted to say something clever, something right. Instead, he took her hand, squeezed it, briefly. Then he let go and kept walking, without looking back. It was a 5-day journey to the capital. Kronshire stood on the bank of a wide river, stone walls, towers, bridges, thousands of houses, temples, a palace on a hill. The city smelled of smoke and bread and sewage and money. Daniel entered through the main gate. Sune was waiting for him at the inn the Viscount had paid for. She looked him over from head to toe. She shook her head. She said he couldn't enter the palace looking like that. They spent the evening getting him ready. Sune bought him a suit, a simple one, brown, but made of good fabric. Without aristocratic embellishments, unpretentious. The suit of a peasant who respects himself but knows his place. Sune said this was important, that the king dislikes upstarts, that modesty would be his weapon. The morning of the audience, the throne room of Kronshire. High stone walls, stained glass windows, red carpets, tapestries bearing coats of arms. Dozens of courtiers, guards at the doors. King Oswald III sat on the throne, an elderly man with a weary face, heavy-lidded eyes. The crown weighed down on his forehead. Advisors stood nearby. To the king's right stood Archbishop Mortimer Valens, tall, thin, a face like that of an old bird, eyes light and cold, a thin smile, a dangerous one. To his left stood Viscount Ashton, upright, calm, with a face of stone. Baron Crane stood to the side. He was sweating. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Daniel entered the hall. He bowed, not too low, as Sune had taught him. He stood up straight, unrolled the scroll, and began to speak. Calmly, steadily, without unnecessary words. Numbers, facts. Tons of grain, liters of medicine, hundreds of families saved, tens of thousands of silver coins in taxes paid by his partners, yields 3 times higher than standard, medicine deliveries to the army during the epidemic, a new variety of grain resistant to rot. He spoke for 10 minutes. The court was silent. Valens smiled. Crane was sweating. The Viscount stood as solid as a rock. When Daniel finished, the king was silent for a long time. A minute, then 2. Then he stood up. The hall fell silent. The king said that a peasant stood before him, that a peasant was not supposed to buy up land, trade outside the guilds, or supply medicine to the army, that this was a violation of the order, that Baron Crane was right in his complaint. Daniel felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. Then the king said, "But." He said that the treasury was empty, that bread riots were imminent, that the army had no medicine, that this peasant had done more for the crown in 2 years than Baron Crane had in 20. That Crane's complaint was that of a man afraid of losing his privileges, not of a man concerned with order. The king turned to Crane. He asked how much grain he had supplied to the capital over the past year. Crane remained silent, because the answer was 0. The king turned back to Daniel. He said there was only one way to resolve this conflict. A peasant cannot do what Roe does, but a baron can. The throne room fell silent. The king spoke. Baron Daniel Roe of Midland. Crane's lands are confiscated for false accusation and transferred to the new baron. The title is granted for services to the crown. Serve the kingdom as you served your village. Crane staggered. He turned pale. He opened his mouth and closed it. Then 2 guards led him away. Valens bowed to the king. His face was serene. But when he straightened up and his eyes met Daniel's, there was nothing serene in them. Ice, calculation, a promise. Daniel bowed to the king. He left the hall. They were waiting for him on the palace steps. They were standing on the steps, everyone. Una, Clara, Sune, Noah, Mei Lin, Hannah, and Lily. They had arrived the day before. Sune had organized it. She found a carriage. She paid for the hotel. She brought everyone here. Lily was the first to see him. She broke free from her mother's arms and ran down the steps. She ran into him. She wrapped her arms around his legs. She pressed her face against his brown suit and said nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just held on. Daniel placed his hand on her head, a red ribbon in her hair, that very one, from Greenford, worn, faded, but still there. He was standing on the steps of the royal palace, Baron Midland, in a simple brown suit with the metal clasp from Hannah, with a sprig of lavender from Mary in his pocket, with a little pot of apple tree from Mei Lin in the bag on his back, with Lily's drawing tucked under his arm. He looked at the people in front of him. 6 women, 1 girl, 1 elderly mother. Each one stood behind him. Each one had come here, 200 kilometers, across winter roads, to a capital city most of them had never seen. Una stood slightly to the side, a notebook pressed to her chest, that very same paper notebook from Sune, full of numbers. She looked at him and didn't smile, but her eyes said what she couldn't say out loud. Clara stood next to Sune, a red dress. She didn't have a glass of wine in her hand, but her expression was as if she'd just had a drink and was feeling good. She smirked and said that now he owed her a discount on tomatoes, since he was a baron. Sune stood with her back straight and a slight smile. She knew this wasn't the end, that Valens wouldn't back down, that a struggle lay ahead. But today she allowed herself to smile. Noah stood slightly behind her, her arms crossed over her chest, her face inscrutable. But when Daniel looked at her, she gave a brief nod. That nod was worth more than all the words. Mei Lin stood by the railing, running her fingers over the stone flowers carved into the balustrade. She greeted them. She whispered something. Hannah stood with her legs spread wide and smiled as she hadn't smiled since her youth. Hannah clung to the railing and cried, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Daniel walked down to them. Lily wouldn't let go of his leg. He walked and she walked beside him, clinging to the fabric of his pant leg. He stopped in front of Hannah. She looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. She said quietly that his father would be proud. Daniel wanted to reply. He couldn't. His throat tightened. He hugged her. For the first time. For real. Not like a stranger hugging someone else's mother. Like a son. Because over the past 2 years, she had become his mother. Not by blood, in every other way. They stood like that for a few seconds. Then Hannah pulled away. She wiped her face. She said it was time to stop standing out in the wind and that everyone needed to eat. They spent the evening at the hotel. A small room, one table. There weren't enough chairs, so Mei Lin sat on the windowsill. Hannah brought ale from the tavern across the street. Clara took a bottle of red wine out of her bag. She'd brought it from Greenford. Hannah laid out the food on the table. Bread made from 10th generation wheat, goat cheese, tomatoes, salted mustard, onions, all their own, all grown on their land. Daniel sat at the head of the table and looked at them, at these people who, 2 years ago, had been nobodies, widows, orphans, debtors, the hungry, the forgotten. Now they were sitting at the same table in the kingdom's capital, eating bread they had grown themselves. Lily was sitting on his lap. She was eating a tomato. Juice was dripping down her chin. She asked if they would have a big house now. Daniel said they would. Lily asked if it would have a garden. He said it would have a garden. Lily asked if she could plant an apple tree in the garden. Daniel looked at the little pot from Mei Lin that was sitting on the windowsill. A tiny sprout, 3 little leaves. He said they'd already brought the apple tree with them. Lily jumped up and ran to the windowsill. She touched a leaf with her finger. She turned to Mei Lin. She asked, "Is that really an apple tree?" Mei Lin nodded and said that the apple tree knew her, that she'd told it about Lily. Lily looked at the sprout with an expression as if she'd seen a living creature. Then she quietly told the apple tree that she was Lily and that they would be friends. Mei Lin smiled, broadly and openly, for the first time in front of everyone. Bran didn't come to the capital. He was too old for the winter roads, but he sent a note with Hannah, a single line in crooked letters. "Dude, I knew you were weird, but I didn't know you were this weird." Daniel laughed when he read it. The evening was winding down. The ale was finished, so was the wine. Hannah was telling a story about how she once shooed a horse backward, and the horse walked backward. Everyone was laughing, even Noah, even Sun-e. Clara sat by the window and looked at the lights of the capital. Daniel walked over to her. He stood beside her, silently. Clara said quietly that her husband had dreamed of bringing her to the capital, that they'd planned to come after the next flight. But there was no next flight. Daniel didn't say anything. He just stood there beside her. A minute later, Clara said that the view from the window wasn't so bad after all, and that tomatoes went better with wine than she'd thought. It was the closest thing to saying she was glad to be here. That night, Daniel stepped out onto the hotel porch. Everyone was asleep. The city had fallen silent. Stars hung above the rooftops. The cold air smelled of smoke and snow. He stood there thinking about what would happen next. The title, the lands, the responsibility, the school for children he'd promised himself he'd build, the seed library, the reform he and Sun-e had drafted, the golden route for the army, new varieties for the new provinces, and Valens, the archbishop who stood in the throne room and smiled, whose eyes promised that this was not the end. Valens knew something about the land, about the accelerator, about an ancient civilization that knew how to talk to plants, about how that civilization had been destroyed, and that the Order of the Wheat Ear was the direct heir to those who had destroyed it. Daniel remembered Aiden's note. He comes at night. He's not who he seems to be. The mystery remained unsolved. The killer was never found. The trail led from the village to Crane's estate, from Crane to the Order, from the Order to Valens, and from Valens to somewhere even higher. Someone in this world had been killing people like Aiden for centuries, children in whose blood the spark of an ancient gift lived. Daniel knew this. He felt it. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he felt it. The ground beneath his feet was alive, not metaphorically, literally. An ancient, semi-conscious force that had placed within the body of a dying boy the soul of a man who knew how to save it. He wasn't a coincidence. He was the answer, the Earth's final answer to a slow genocide that had been going on for 2 millennia. He thought about this, and it terrified him, not for himself, for Lily, who was sleeping in her room, hugging a pot with an apple tree, for Yuna, who had fallen asleep with a notebook under her pillow, for Hana, who prayed before bed for her son, whoever he might be, for all those people who stood beside him, unaware that he was dragging a shadow 2 millennia long behind him. Footsteps sounded outside the door. Yuna stepped out onto the porch. She draped a shawl over her shoulders. She stood beside him, in silence. They stood there and looked at the stars. Then Yuna said quietly that she couldn't sleep. Daniel said he couldn't either. Yuna was silent for a moment. Then she asked what he was going to do now. Daniel said he would build what he had promised. A school, a library, a farm where no one would go hungry. Yuna nodded. Then she said she wanted to be there with him, while he was building. Not because he was a baron, not because he had money and land, but because he was the first person to ask her what she wanted. Daniel turned to face her. She stood in the starlight. Her expression was serious. Her eyes were steady. Her hands clenched on her shawl. A 19-year-old peasant girl who, in a year and a half, had learned to keep the books, who could calculate faster than the city clerks, who had never once complained, never once asked for anything for herself. She just worked, silently, stubbornly, by his side. He had said she would be by his side, that he couldn't manage without her, that he needed someone who knew every number, every sack, every grain. Yuna quietly said she wasn't interested in numbers. Daniel fell silent. Yuna looked at him without taking her eyes off him. No fear, no flirtation, straightforwardness, the very same straightforwardness she'd had from day one. He took her hand, not like that time on the outskirts, briefly and hurriedly. Slowly, carefully, he intertwined their fingers. Her palm was cold and rough from work. He squeezed. She squeezed back. They stood on the porch of a hotel in the kingdom's capital. 2 peasants. Former peasants. He, with a stranger's soul in a young body, she, with numbers in her head and iron in her character. And between them was what had been growing for a year and a half, unnoticed, like a fine tree, strong. A minute later, Eunice said her feet were freezing, and that if he was going to hold her hand all night, he should at least come inside. Daniel laughed. They went into the hotel. Far to the north, in the village of Meadowbrook, which would soon become the capital of the barony of Meadowland, old Bran sat on the porch of his house and gazed at the stars. The same night, the same sky. Before him lay the fields, dark, sleeping beneath the snow. But he knew that beneath the snow the earth was alive, dark, loose, ready for spring. The earth that the lad Ro had taught to breathe. Bran grunted. He crossed himself, and he went to bed. Meanwhile, somewhere in the basement of the capital's monastery, Archbishop Mortimer Valens sat at a stone table. An old book lay before him, a very old one. The parchment pages had darkened with age. The letters were written in a language that had not existed for 2,000 years. Valens traced a line with his finger. He read slowly. His lips moved. The candle cast shadows on the walls, covered with ancient symbols. Valens closed the book. He gazed into the darkness. He murmured that the earth had answered after all, that they had already killed such people, and that they would kill this one too. Then he blew out the candle. Darkness filled the cellar. But in a distant northern province, in a warm barn behind a false wall, winter apple trees were quietly blooming. No one saw them, no one heard them, but they were blooming. White petals unfurled in the silence, one by one, stubbornly, patiently, like everything Daniel Carter had ever planted, like everything he had ever done in his 2 lives, not for himself, for those who would come after him.